This guy was incredibly strong, one of the strongest that ever existed. He ended up dying in his last battle. After that, you can already imagine. Our badass came back in the body of a teenager who was very weak. But with his power, he is going to haunt everyone, striking sword blows to their heads. At the top of the hill on the eve of sunset, an explosion occurs. This ended up raising a great amount of dust. And at the center of that mess, two men are playing with swords. The attacker has several scars on his face, and the one defending the blow is unimpressed by his power. In fact, the old man is impressed that the young man can still move after being wounded. His mental strength is very high and fits very well with his sword style, the ghost style. Because of that, the old man had to acknowledge that this technique is truly very good. But it wasn't enough for it to be good to pressure that old man, who seems to be gaining the upper hand in the fight. With his opponent wounded, he said that he couldn't use internal energy and that it's already a miracle he can still move. After gathering his internal energy into the sword, the old man said the battle would soon be over, as he was about to take the young man's life. He began to advance furiously, throwing a great power of internal energy at the young man. Even though he was severely injured, the young man managed to defend himself from that blow. But he was immediately caught off guard by the old man's approach, who managed to land a kick to his stomach, throwing the young man's body far away, driving him across the ground. He was nearly pierced by the old man's sword, which was lodged in the ground. Now that they were close, the young man managed to surprise the old man, and with just one kick, he disarmed him of his sword. The young man with scars on his face is still carrying his blade, showing great determination. He tried to thrust at the old man, but the elder dodged easily. However, realizing the great risk, his face was wounded by the strike. Immediately, he was surprised by a punch from the young man, who struck his face forcefully. Now it was the old man who was thrown to the ground like a sack of garbage. He didn't like getting beaten like that, and gathering his internal energy into one hand said he'd make the young man pay. But as soon as he executed his attack, he was surprised. There was nothing in front of his eyes. While wondering where the young man had gone, that same young man was about to surprise him from behind. That's when the old man realized he should have stayed retired playing Sudoku at home, because his body was separated into two nearly symmetrical halves. After that, the white-haired man seemed to sigh in relief. He asked if the ghost swordsman had managed to defeat that old demon, and the man with the scars on his face replied that yes, he had. Now that he was dead, the bloodbath could end and the Shaanxi massacre would finally come to a close. He looked at the bodies on the ground and called them idiots, saying they showed up claiming to be black knights and had killed many people in the past 3 days. Thanks to that, the world witnessed the alliance of two rivals, the orthodox faction and the unorthodox one. Hearing these words, a long-haired man called the ghost swordsman by name Dako Hien. The promise they made to duel after developing their techniques might be one he won't be able to fulfill. And the ghost swordsman asked if that was what he was going to say before dying. The other long-haired man said they had dedicated their entire lives to the sword. He fought against many martial artists, witnessed many techniques, but never saw anything as precise as the ghost technique. That guy's devotion was greater than everyone else's. That's the reason he could make this request, and the ghost swordsman wanted to know what it was. That's when the long-haired man said he had a disciple in the Manhwa sect. The more he listened to these words, the more the ghost swordsman became irritated. He asked if his friend was going crazy from dying because he was making that request to the best unorthodox swordsman. Didn't make any sense. But without saying a word, the long-haired man handed him an artifact, saying the spirit of the plum tree was with him and asking the ghost swordsman to deliver that relic to the sect leader. The scared young man even tried to question it, but went silent. His friend was already very short of breath. That's when he realized that the long-haired man was about to find out whether God existed. The ghost swordsman also said he was risking his own life. This was a difficult request to fulfill. The long-haired man said they were the only friends they had, and though it was awkward to admit that, he was very grateful. And the scared young man said he should be because of that request. He would now spend the rest of his life on that mountain. That's when the internal energy in the young man's body began to destabilize, causing something horrible to witness. His body was no longer in one piece. His life was over. The ghost swordsman was still in shock from witnessing it firsthand, without realizing there was another source of energy nearby approaching him. It was coming like a slash, quickly closing in. As the attack neared, the swordsman began to grow angry. He was furious about what he had just seen. With his sword in hand, he wanted to know who was responsible for that. And executing one of his techniques, he managed to block the incoming attack. He calmly observed what was in front of him. A masked man appeared to be responsible. And unlike what the ghost swordsman expected, that man carried no sword at all. After defending himself, the scarred man started to feel confused, noting that the figure before him manipulated energy with great mastery. It didn't take long for huge explosions to occur on that plateau, heading toward where the ghost swordsman was. The dust raised by it spread across the entire summit. In the midst of the dust is the ghost swordsman, who was severely injured by those attacks. He was still trying to understand how this happened, and how someone so strong could be walking this earth. At that moment, he realized that if he were left-handed, he wouldn't be able to write his name. That masked man. He thought he was the master of the Black Knights. But now the young man began to doubt because he thought he had defeated that master, and his body wasn't far from there. He began to wonder if this could be a hidden disciple, or worse, maybe this one was the real master. And feeling the pain of his wounds, He was sure this was a much more powerful opponent. Even though he was weakened from the last battle, it was impressive that he had lost an arm to an attack made purely of demonic energy. Thus, he began to apologize to his friend as he hadn't even had the chance to take his body back to his homeland to be buried. Even though he was full of regret, this warrior had determination, and he was determined not to give up. Standing up, he said he would fulfill his part of the promise. He began to run toward the cliff. He didn't know if he would survive the fall after losing an arm, but it was his only option. Looking back, he acknowledged that he was running from that fight, but he wouldn't forget that person, and the next time they met would be the last. It was just as he finished that thought that his body was cut into 2 pieces. The young man tried to understand why things were turning upside down, realizing that as he fell from the cliff, his legs were going in another direction, and the one responsible was that masked figure. The young man no longer had the strength to say anything, and as he fell into oblivion, he didn't want that masked man to be smiling about it. He began to apologize to his friend for not being able to keep his promise. That's when the artifact he had placed on one of his arms began to glow. A great source of energy was emanating from his body, and the young man began to think that heaven was helping in that situation. He could feel his pulse again. But as soon as he started to open his eyes, he was no longer in that place. Some people were telling him to wake up, calling him senior disciple. Trying to wake up, he found it very strange to be called that way. One of those present told Baek Jin that the senior disciple had finally opened his eyes. Approaching the young man, he said he had done well to survive, and now he needed to stay with them. That's when our boy realized he knew that man. The old man had done the best he could with acupuncture and didn't expect it to work. Our boy knows that this elder is Baek Jin, the leader of Manhwa, and the old man asked him to stay strong, calling him Mu Hui. That's when our young man remembered the identity of that name. It belongs to the 2nd generation of disciples, being the personal student of Hyunjo. He just doesn't know why he's being called that. The old man must have gone crazy that he remembered that artifact. He began to talk about the light he had seen before, and the boy next to him didn't understand. He simply said his wounds hadn't healed yet and he should avoid speaking. Without understanding what had happened, our boy realized he had a lot to figure out. After recovering a bit, he was already able to walk, and someone asked if he was going out. Our boy confirmed, though he almost gave a rude answer. Old Baek Jin agreed, saying it wasn't a bad idea to move the body a little, but he warned that he should take it easy, because aside from recovering over the past week, he hadn't been able to eat properly. The boy went to a lake outside, and upon arriving, he washed his own face, while thinking that only 7 days had passed since everything happened. The feeling he had was that it had felt like an entire year, and in the past 7 days, he had dreamed he lived a different life. Memories from that body and from the training of that sect from the past 20 years of Muhui's life. He also saw a massive attack that happened in that place. Everything was on fire and enemies were everywhere. It was during that moment that his body was struck by a blade. Our protagonist found that behavior incredibly foolish. Since the owner of that body was very weak, he shouldn't have acted that way. Certainly, because of that wound, he ended up dying. Then he started to remember that mysterious light that came from the artifact he had received, though he didn't know why he was chosen, much less why he ended up in that guy's life, and not in the body of Hyunjo. He started thinking maybe it was fate's doing, but that only made him sigh even deeper. He may not like what happened, but he couldn't ignore the fact that he had been given another chance at life, and he couldn't waste it. That masked bastard, he was definitely going to find him and cut him to pieces. He was definitely a much stronger enemy than the master of the Black Knights. He would have lost to him even if he hadn't been injured. So if he wants a chance to defeat him, he needs to become even stronger than he ever was before, the boy said as he climbed some stairs, reaching the building ahead of him. As he approached the altar, he remembered his friend's words, asking him to take care of his disciple. In the memories of that body, he also recalled other moments from the attack, where the disciples were being encouraged to protect the sect. Our boy started picking up some books, promising that his friend didn't need to worry about anything, because he would make sure to fulfill that promise and avenge his death no matter what. The elders realized they would need to rebuild 8 pavilions, as they weren't able to control the fire in time, and their leader presumed they didn't have enough money left. Baek confirmed that resources were scarce and that profits and visitors to the place would be reduced for a while. This news worried the elders. Baek knew they had to avoid big expenses, so he decided to prioritize the most important pavilions. Then he asked how the disciples' recovery was going. Baek Jin replied that everything was going well, even the seriously injured were already recovering. The leader was pleased by this news and asked specifically about Mu Wei, since the news about Hyunjo wasn't good. The old man said the boy had received more than he expected, and that his recovery was going very well. He had even managed to walk outside. Knowing this, the leader was glad for the good news, but warned that it was wise to check on the boy from time to time, since they knew what kind of young man he was. He believed the boy might just be pretending to be better, though deep down he hoped he really had improved. And inside that library, our boy was there reading all those books, learning techniques he had never seen before, that made him remember events from his past life. He had already been to that place with his friend, who asked what he thought of the disciples. Our boy's direct answer was that they were completely useless. His friend agreed, stating that the Sect's technique was regressing. Those people were just fooling themselves into thinking they had reached the pinnacle of the sword, which in truth was the very control of variables and illusions that made the plum blossom bloom. He told our boy that he should already know this. A sect that cannot develop new paths is doomed to failure. And that was certainly true, but still, forcing change wasn't a solution. So our boy asked if the long-haired man had any ideas to solve that problem. And the long-haired man confidently replied that he would show them how it's done. That the blooming sword technique wasn't all there was a new level they hadn't yet reached. That's when our boy asked if that's what he meant when he suggested they should create a sword technique of their own, so they could duel in the future. All that is now just a memory, and he began to remember how he felt when he first saw those disciples. He thought the problem was in the sect itself, that even though it was renowned and famous, it couldn't produce many talents. Hyunjo had been the last in hundreds of years, but now the boy realized that was a shallow thought. After reading those techniques, he saw that they were flawless, and martial techniques grow stronger with time as they pass through others. That is the power of a sect, and this one had hit a blockage from growing too large. So he began to think about the technique his friend hadn't been able to complete, taking on the responsibility to finish it in his place as a way of fulfilling his promise. And that technique needs to drink from Manhwa's source. The shape of its movements and intent must be aligned with the sect. It all begins with the boy learning that place's principles, starting from the basics so he could later reach his friend's sword technique. He began to meditate, focusing his internal energy. That process was to erase what that body had learned, because when he tried to learn, it would be different, since the knowledge of that body wasn't his. Not to mention he couldn't underestimate the technique just because it was basic. Autumn circulation was a refined and very stable technique. In his past life, he relied on what was unorthodox. But Manhwa's sword techniques were very different, and he might end up learning something new. The life of the sword's ghost, who cared only about the blade, had changed. From now on, his name is Manhwa. Time passed, and our boy remained inside studying. Another disciple of the sect was heading toward the same building. Before going in, he found something strange. The place was closed, and from outside he started shouting, asking if the senior disciple was inside. Our boy had to interrupt his meditation session because of that, so he got up to open the door, coming face to face with the concerned disciple outside. His expression looked very tired, and our boy asked if his name was Mujin, and what brought him there. The young man said it had been 3 days since our boy left the infirmary, and he still hadn't shown up for training sessions. This news surprised our boy. He had no idea that 3 days had passed, which left him deep in thought. He quickly remembered he hadn't eaten properly for a week. He started recalling when he was trapped in the blood sect storm and their flawless techniques. He told the boy he didn't know so much time had passed, and that he would return with him to the training hall. But that young man looked at our protagonist a bit suspiciously, sensing there was something very different about him, while our protagonist thought to himself that a drink would be great right now. In the training hall, someone was giving orders to all the disciples, showing them how to execute that sword technique. All the students were trying to mimic the strikes as best as they could, while the instructor went around correcting them. He had asked Miriam to raise her arm a bit more, and the girl said she would do it that way. As soon as he got there, our protagonist realized everything was just as he expected. The students were still terrible as always. So bad they couldn't maintain balance, which completely disrupted their weight distribution. That way, they couldn't put any power into their strikes. Besides that, their posture was crap. They were failing at the basics. Even though it was a complete mess, he noticed that the instructor wasn't actually that bad, and he began to wonder if that one was named Mujin. At the very least, there was one competent person in that place, someone who seemed committed to educating the students. He must also be a serious disciple. Now he started to wonder why that young man was doing all this, knowing that the original owner of that body was likely very shy. He also didn't have many leadership or martial skills. Unlike Mujin, Mujin seemed to know how to lead others, had a calm personality, and showed great potential. Naturally, the new students would want to listen to him. Those with talent and skill get opportunities, so our boy didn't have much to do in response to that. At least he hadn't had any reason to intervene, until now. That was when Mujin signaled that the training was over. The students seemed very tired, feeling like Mujin was becoming increasingly strict with them. That's when some of them noticed that our protagonist had returned and asked if he was feeling better. The boy replied that he was, but the girl who had asked that question became curious, sensing there was something different about him. That's when someone else approached our boy, saying that he had finally returned. It was Mujin, who hadn't been able to speak with him properly earlier because he was in the middle of training. Our boy signaled that he understood the reason, saying that it must be very difficult to lead something that he should have been doing himself. But even as he said that, he was wondering why he didn't descend the stairs. Mujin said he was grateful for having had the opportunity, but our boy replied that from now on he would take it from here. That placed a hint of anger in Mujin's eyes. The students hadn't even left the place yet and overheard everything. The one who had gone to fetch our protagonist from the room realized he wasn't mistaken. That young man had truly changed. Mujin said it was the protagonist himself who had entrusted him with the task. That was when our boy asked if there was anything wrong with him taking back his own responsibilities. Mujin replied that this only happened because the boy hadn't been confident enough. Now with a smirk on his face, our protagonist knew exactly what was happening. That idiot standing before him was planning to become the head disciple. That position would one day allow him to become the sect leader's successor. And due to the massacre, there were few first-generation disciples left in that place, place, and both they and the elders were too busy rebuilding what had been destroyed. Our boy knew that if he wanted to change that sect, it would be easier to start with the second-generation disciples, not to mention the purple aura circulation technique. Only the sect leader and the head disciple could learn this technique. It was one of the 10 most powerful techniques when it came to internal energy circulation, and he needed it to become stronger than his past self. That's why he needed the position of head disciple, and he knew the next words would be shocking to Mujin. But Mujin had a question of his own, asking if our boy even had the right to do that. He asked what he had done during the invasion by the Black Knights. The elders had told him not to engage in combat, but he ignored their advice, and something happened because of it. He didn't save anyone. He didn't defeat any enemies. All he managed to do was become a burden to the elders. And because of what he did, many other disciples followed his lead. If the first-generation disciples hadn't risked themselves to protect them, many people wouldn't be there now. Our protagonist agreed with every word, which only made Mujin even more upset. And our boy said he intended to take on the responsibilities of head disciple, but Mujin said they couldn't trust him. Approaching him, our protagonist said that the boy was misunderstanding a few things. Mujin started thinking while our boy drew closer and closer until he asked what he had misunderstood. And in a threatening tone, our boy asked since when did he have to look up to see Mujin, and he asked if it looked like he was trying to convince him or if he needed permission to declare the choices he had made. After all, he wasn't making a request. He was notifying that disciple. That was when Mujin realized something was wrong. That man in front of him wasn't the same senior disciple he had once known. Our boy said that he would be responsible for the next day's training, and if Mujin had any complaints, he should bring them up after the session. And as he walked away, he told the boy not to get all worked up. Mujin commented that the senior seemed like a completely different person. Our boy said that people change after seeing death, and maybe that's what happened to him. The other students started talking about what had just happened. No one could understand the change, and they wanted to know if the senior disciple was really going to lead training the next day. Some of them went to Murian, bringing the news that the senior disciple would be leading the session. They thought it was strange. First he seemed annoyed, then very calm, and they hadn't heard the full conversation. One of them was worried, knowing how skilled our boy really was, and the girl asked what would happen if they did the same thing. Her peer didn't understand, so she decided to explain. They should try talking to him. It was already nighttime, and our protagonist was meditating. That was when he heard voices outside his room. The voice said he wasn't asleep yet and had come by to talk, and that the topic should be discussed without others present. Grabbing his sword, our boy said he was very curious about the subject. Those who came to talk to our protagonist were now very surprised. Outside his room, they noticed the boy had come out carrying a wooden sword. They knew that wasn't like him at all, and the girl got straight to the point. She wanted him to reconsider his decision as she believed Mujin had avoided continuing the argument to preserve his image. Our boy asked if they were sent there by that guy, but the students assured him they came of their own will. Our protagonist said it wasn't their place to decide that and that he would pretend he hadn't heard anything. But the girl insisted. She wanted them to consider the student's perspective. They weren't doing this because they disliked him, but because they wanted to learn from someone who actually knew something. Saying that our protagonist should self-reflect, he didn't have what it takes and was being selfish. They didn't want a leader who was beneath them. Those were insolent words, and our boy didn't like it, stating that the hierarchy of that sect seemed to have degraded quite a bit. He acknowledged the students' words, and since they doubted his abilities, he decided to show a little of them, ordering them to grab their swords. The students thought he was joking, but our boy knew exactly how they were feeling. According to the order, the students said he had asked for it. The girl was the first to move toward him, saying he would soon regret what he had asked for. But before she could strike, she was immediately disarmed by our boy. As if that wasn't enough, she took a hit to the chest that knocked the wind out of her, all just to teach them a few things. The other student decided it was time to attack too, but with him, our protagonist was less merciful, hitting him square in the face with the wooden sword. Now the two who had been proud and defiant were lying on the ground, completely defeated. The girl couldn't even properly say she had lost, and our protagonist responded that the outcome had been obvious, and he would take the opportunity to teach them both an important lesson. That's when the girl realized her troubles were just beginning. After putting the students through some physical punishment and giving them a free face massage, our protagonist asked if they were satisfied with their skills. They said yes. He also asked if they knew what would happen if other students ganged up to fight him. Both replied in unison that they'd get beaten along with them. He asked if they thought he was weaker than Mujin. They said no, that he was much stronger. He asked if they still thought he was weaker than the other disciples. They both answered no. Now it seemed they had learned their lesson. Our boy said he would forget what had happened that night because everyone can make mistakes. Morning training time was coming soon, so the two of them needed to get some rest. The students thanked the senior disciple for his mercy, leaving the area with great difficulty. All while our protagonist silently watched. He knew he was being watched and asked how long that person planned to keep hiding. Revealing himself, the boy asked how he knew he was being watched, and our protagonist said he was too big to hide. Muchiel said he saw other disciples heading to our protagonist's room and ended up following them just in case. He hadn't imagined our protagonist would be able to defeat them. Then the boy asked if our protagonist had been hiding his power all this time. For a brief moment, he began to think. He realized that second-generation disciples could be divided into two types: those who stayed distant from Manhwa, but maintained a certain level of respect, and those who despised him and spoke badly about him behind his back. Mujin didn't fit into either of those groups. In fact, he constantly helped Manhwa, but our protagonist didn't know why he did such a thing. Maybe it was because he was a bit older, and our protagonist thought he knew the real reason. It might just be that he was worried, since the old Manhwa was very weak, so weak that he needed help from others. Mujin probably thought our protagonist could get seriously hurt in that situation, so he followed those other students to make sure nothing would happen, and it certainly wasn't the first time he did it. Our boy planned to give him a plausible explanation for his power. He said he hadn't been hiding it, he had simply reached a new level. Those words left his peer quite thoughtful. While our protagonist promised to talk more about it during morning training, and since it was already late, they needed to rest, Mujin simply watched our boy return to his room, trying to understand what he meant by reaching a new level, because he had seen the protagonist use a basic sword technique. But something else surprised him greatly. That was the most beautiful execution he had ever seen in his entire life, and he began to wonder what was different about his friend. He had always thought he was extremely weak, but something had changed, enough to make him excited for training, and our boy realized he needed to give a proper explanation once it started. Inside the disciples' dormitory, another student wasn't happy, because he had heard that his peers had been beaten up, that it wasn't the senior they used to know, but a completely different person. They were telling Maria they had really taken a beating, but the disciples said they were talking nonsense and should just go to sleep. As they left completely bruised, they started to regret not believing what they were told, hoping that Mujin would find out the hard way they were telling the truth. That's when Mujin saw those battered disciples walking down the hallway and became very curious. He immediately asked what happened, since they were limping and looked terrible. The other disciples said it was nothing. They just hadn't liked the news that the senior disciple would be leading morning training. After a brief chat, he explained everything to Mujin, and he said he would have to discipline those two later, which surprised that disciple. Even though the senior disciple was staking his claim, he would soon realize that role didn't belong to him, and they shouldn't have done it behind Mujin's back. He felt very ashamed, and the disciple tried to say they were just concerned, but Mujin ignored those words. He said he would take care of it, but it wasn't the younger disciple's place to interfere, leaving the boy quiet and embarrassed. The next day, everyone had gathered for morning training, which was immediately confirmed by our protagonist. He said he wanted to say a few words before training began, and people started wondering how someone could change so much from one day to the next. Maybe he had been hiding his abilities. Mujin was impressed he had managed to beat those two students. He started to think maybe Mujin had helped him, which would have been plausible, but he would soon learn the full truth. Through that training, he found out whether it was just a bluff, and our boy got straight to the point, saying that they were all weak. Even though there are many reasons someone becomes strong, there's only one reason for weakness: neglecting the basics. And because of that, they would only train the 6-strike sword technique that morning, the basic technique. He believed everyone wanted to learn it properly first, so they could move on to more complex techniques. After saying that, our boy began observing the students. Many were silent and some deep in thought, until one of them asked if there was anything wrong with wanting to learn things quickly, while thinking that if his peers hadn't been able to expose this farce, he would be the one to do it. And his classmates who had been beaten the night before realized that if things kept going this way, they'd be beaten again. The boy kept saying some arrogant things. That's when our protagonist called Mujin to come speak with him directly. It didn't take long before several students were completely surprised. Even Mujin hadn't expected something like that, and he began to wonder what our protagonist was planning to do. Poor Mujin walked toward our protagonist with a lot of confidence. He said he knew what was going to happen, but wasn't sure it was a good idea to leave training under our protagonist's leadership, and that the basic technique wasn't as important as he was claiming, and everyone knew his technique was awful. It was our protagonist who said the last word, as if he had guessed what the boy was about to say, believing that the boy had come to challenge him in front of everyone. Our protagonist already knew he wouldn't be easily accepted, so he asked everyone to pay attention. He said he wouldn't take a single step from his position and would use that basic technique to block Mujin's attacks, leaving the students stunned. And our protagonist guaranteed that if he were touched by Mujin's sword or took even one step, he'd lose that duel. If Mujin won, he wouldn't teach the 6-strike technique. And that wasn't all. He guaranteed he wouldn't be in charge of morning training. That made Mujin pay close attention. The arrogant student thought our protagonist was being too full of himself just because he beat up those two, and our boy confirmed they were indeed badly hurt in that fight. Mujin only told our protagonist not to hate him after losing in front of all the disciples, while our boy hoped the idiot wouldn't cross that line. It didn't take long for their duel to begin, and our boy was able to hold his ground confidently, blocking every sword strike with great mastery. No matter where the attacks came from, he blocked them all. And the students were becoming increasingly impressed, since Mujin was only increasing the speed and intensity of his attacks. He started delivering a massive barrage of strikes. One of the girls realized that was the wind-focused sword. That technique was known for its speed, and among second-generation disciples, Mu-Rian was the one who performed it best. Keel also knew the boy had improved, but it didn't seem to be enough. Because our protagonist blocked all of those attacks with ease, our boy admitted that he needed to use more strength to deal with that guy than the others he had fought. In other words, he said that kid was less terrible than the rest. Then he asked if that was all he had to show. Rian started feeling frustrated, but the truth was, he didn't master any other technique as well as this one, and you began to wonder what he could do during the match. The disciples knew Rian was very good, but the senior was really better. They no longer knew what happened to him, since he wasn't fazed by any of those blows. Mujin was also at a complete loss for words, watching that duel, trying to understand how this had happened. Because nothing Rian had tried had worked, he reached a point where he didn't know what to do and began wondering when the senior had improved so much. Our boy told him the answer wasn't strength. The sword must be swung with the whole body, and the most important part of this stage was the feet, because that's where movement begins. Without mastering that, the sword becomes useless. Our boy said he wasn't even fully healed yet and still blocked all those attacks. That's why Rian's technique was terrible. Then he asked if Rian could now understand why they had to start with the basics. Rian, fully defeated, realized that the basics were important, but our protagonist thought he hadn't truly grasped that yet, saying he would now show him what it meant to move a sword using the entire body. Rian tried to correct himself, saying he hadn't meant anything against him, and the poor disciples watched in great fear. They had to take that student to the infirmary. While some ran to help him, others were completely stunned, and our protagonist asked what they were doing just standing there. They should be raising their swords now. If they didn't, he would take it as them questioning his methods, and they could fight him to express their dissatisfaction. Seeing that they were all raising their swords, our boy realized they had accepted his teachings. Finally, he could begin training them. The training session began, and there was a bit of blood on our protagonist's face, but it wasn't his. Our boy began correcting each of his new students, teaching each of them the basics, and he began to remember his past life when his friend was talking about Manhwa, his disciple, who didn't have any remarkable qualities. The long-haired man admitted the boy was quite ordinary, but there was something else about him. He had never seen the boy give up on anything in life, and our protagonist asked if he had chosen the boy solely because of his determination. The long-haired man said other disciples found enlightenment through their own paths, but that wasn't the case with Manhwa. To turn an ordinary person into a martial artist, a mentor is needed. That task was his, and our protagonist acknowledged that it would be great to have only talented people as students, but he was no longer the ghost swordsman. He was the senior disciple, someone responsible for teaching the younger ones the principles of the sect. He wouldn't leave anyone behind. They would all remain together until the end. But he realized that in his past life he wasn't a good teacher, and now he had a big class. Having disciples was more annoying than he had imagined, and he thought that if he met his friend in the afterlife, he'd make him pay with a really good drink. That's when he asked if Mujin was already tired, telling him he should try harder. Somewhere deep in a forest, someone wondered how the boy was doing, since he had focused on making him tougher, not turning him into a teacher. But one thing was certain, the boy wasn't losing fights and must be doing well. Leaving a trail of defeated enemies behind, he admitted it would be great to meet him again. Now one of those disciples was panting heavily. They were all going through very harsh training, carrying weights as they exercised. Certainly, this would be a hard road for them, as they had to start from scratch. Our protagonist was sure they would blossom after this challenge, and their brilliance would be deep and strong, unable to be contained. Besides that, our protagonist also had a long road ahead. Amid those trees full of blossoms, he walked through the crimson forest. Those were the first steps he took to change the path and eventually create his own martial domain. One of the most important things about this was to refine his own senses. The sharper they became, the easier it would be to detect small changes. This happened naturally while training martial arts. He hadn't felt that when he first opened his eyes in this new body, but now he was able to perceive things, realizing that someone was watching him. At the moment, it didn't feel hostile. It seemed the person watching was doing so out of curiosity, and our protagonist couldn't yet tell who it was. But eventually, he would know who was observing him so skillfully. He was heading to a building inside the sect. Inside was Hyungak, who was surprised by the visit. As soon as he welcomed Mugwai, our boy greeted him formally. The man asked if he needed anything, and our boy revealed he wanted to learn the secret techniques. The man thought to himself how surprising that was and seemed to agree with the request. He said his wounds hadn't healed yet, so he should be careful, and our boy confirmed that he would be cautious. That man had also heard that his disciple had been rude to our protagonist, but our boy had no idea who it could be. He still didn't know everyone's names. What he did know was that he had thoroughly beaten those 3 clowns, and in the end it didn't matter who that disciple was. Still, he began to think the man might be angry about it, and to his surprise, the man apologized for what happened, saying that Mujin did something he shouldn't have done, and if it had been back in his day, the consequences would have been far worse, and he apologized for not raising the boy properly. Now our protagonist knew who it was and was still surprised that his actions hadn't caused a much bigger problem. He told the man that he simply did what his senior disciple should have done, so there was no need to worry, which caught the man off guard. He began looking at our boy with wide eyes, impressed by the sense of responsibility he had taken on as senior disciple, until he noticed something different about him. Mui's eyes were different. He hadn't known the boy had such a deep gaze. Our boy felt like he was being watched and began to wonder if the man had changed his mind and might try some kind of retaliation. But the truth was, the man had simply noticed the determination in his eyes, saying it was a good thing that he was taking care of the younger disciples, and he had no intention of stopping him, telling him he could go on his way. Watching him leave, he remembered that the boy's master had died, and he had been left alone. And now, despite all that hardship, he was determined, and the man felt proud of the young man who was pulling himself together with dignity. Now that he had access to the secret techniques, our boy began to study them diligently. He was about to take the first step toward building his own martial domain. He might start with strength, but he knew that was the wrong answer. Life and death weren't decided by strength alone. No one fights recklessly when their life is on the line in Jianghu. The most important thing is to survive, and for that, one must use their techniques with precision and efficiency, having great reasoning skills and a body that can keep up with the mind. To form a martial domain, one must master their techniques. Experience and wisdom come with the process. The mind must be focused through endless contemplation and reflection. That was the definition of a martial domain he had discovered in his past life. That's how the sword ghost lived, developing his own secret techniques. And contemplating the first step that must be taken is to truly understand what martial arts are. That's why he needs to know the secret of Manhwa and its true meaning. He doesn't have that answer yet. There is knowledge he still cannot access. Disciples can't have access to everything, so they don't become greedy or foolishly try to leap beyond their limits. All sects restrict access to knowledge, and this sect is no different. Our boy had heard from Hyunjo that the sect was on the losing side, but a renowned sect will always be renowned. Their martial artists are very systematic, so the notes are not hard to understand. That most basic technique, the 6-strike combo, once learned, allowed our boy to master 3 other techniques: the focused wind, the fallen plum blossom, and the 1,000-fragrance sword. After learning the basics of these techniques, he could finally reach the secrets of the plum blossom sword. Only then would he reach the true secrets: the 7 deadly petals, the triple-edged petal, and the lucid petal sword. The strength of the sect lies in these techniques. The best of Manhwa learned more than one of these techniques. The 6-strike technique is the beginning of everything, followed by the plum blossom and others. A martial artist who perfects this sect's doctrine becomes part of the plum tree itself. That summarizes everything he understood so far. He had just reached the shallowest branch, and he deeply wanted to climb to the higher ones. But first he had to master the plum blossom sword, a weapon given only to those who earn recognition from their masters. It is a symbol of the sect. Our boy realized he needed to reach it as soon as possible. That's when one of the masters noticed he was studying the secrets of the plum blossom sword. It was the sect leader himself. He had come to see who was in that place, since it wasn't usually visited, and he was surprised to see our boy there so late. He asked if he could sit beside him. Our boy said he had no objections, and the full moon shone in the sky. Our boy hadn't noticed how quickly time had passed. Certainly, Hyun-gak had kindly lit the candles for him. With one of the books in hand, the master asked if the boy had read it all, and the boy said yes. The master had heard he had resumed teaching the 6-strike technique to the 2nd-generation disciples, and also that he was in charge of morning training. The master decided to ask why he wanted to teach that technique, while our boy wondered about the reason for such questioning. The truth is, the master was curious. Manhwa always hesitated to answer him even when the questions were simple. Besides having changed, the boy was now doing things he had never done before. There was concern in his thoughts, since the boy had lost his master. Our boy figured that was probably the reason too. The master only hoped that he wasn't pretending to be better, and our protagonist managed to sense that he was being tested. He decided he would give the answers the master wanted, telling him that the foundation of the sect was that 6-strike combination, and the man agreed. Continuing his explanation, he said that the 2nd-generation disciples had started the wrong way, which left the master impressed. But the boy was even harsher with his words, saying that maybe those disciples hadn't even truly started learning. And the master was genuinely surprised. Our boy imagined that the master must already know that the 2nd generation was indeed very poor, and by telling him what he really thought, they would likely end up agreeing. But the master realized that Mui's condition was even worse than he had imagined. Now the two were looking at each other, both deep in thought. The sect master is wondering if the boy standing in front of him is the same one he once knew. At first, he was a very innocent boy, someone who would never do anything bad to anyone. It's truly interesting that he ended up like this. It may be that the attack caused by the Black Knights has led to this, and the boy might be cultivating a deep resentment. Perhaps he is still punishing himself for what happened. The master thought he should tell him that the boy is not to blame, but as he continued his speech, our protagonist said that they all already know. That sentence took the master by surprise. Mui continued his reasoning, saying that all the 2nd generation disciples already know the 6 strikes technique, since it is the first step for all the others. The problem is that in their current state, their technique has worsened considerably. The master understood what the boy meant. It seems the disciples are regressing, and he asked what the reason for that might be. The sects and clans that exist in Jianghu have different ideologies, and those end up merging with their martial arts, which are an expression of their ideas, like the Teiji sect and their enlightenment for the art of the sword, or the sun-crushing sword sect. These are some examples of what he was talking about. It's not enough to merely train the disciple's body, it's necessary to explore and understand the ideology of one's own clan. The master noticed that our protagonist was explaining all of this very calmly, being extremely precise with his words. In some way, he couldn't explain that boy made him think of Kimonjo, and our protagonist continued explaining, the disciples are skipping steps. That doesn't mean it's wrong, but it's definitely not wise. After hearing all that, the master asked what he was proposing, and our boy said that he needs to help them realize that learning the clan's special technique is not the focus of martial arts. They need to train hard and apply that to their daily lives. That is the true essence of that school. For the plum blossom is not the end of all things. The master was surprised to hear those words. It was as if he were speaking with Hyunjo himself. Although they are nothing alike, he could feel the presence of the master within that disciple, who was shining just as Hyunjo did in the past. He began to wonder if he was the only one who saw the true talent in that child. The master revealed that the plum blossom technique comes naturally through training, and that the boy thinks deeply despite his young age. He had made an excellent observation. Now he wanted to know what our protagonist would do, and the boy said he intends to guide the disciples in their training, so they can master the 6 strikes technique. But that wasn't what the master wanted to know. He knew our protagonist would do that flawlessly. He wanted to know what path the young man would follow. So he began to think about it, and about things from his past life. After studying the techniques of that sect, he realized that all of them are of great quality. But he also found things that are somewhat frustrating, and he is someone who prioritizes efficiency in order to survive. He questioned the small size of the swords or the techniques that ignored weapons entirely. This led him to many different thoughts, thinking that combat tactics were lacking. It could be that his path will differ from that of the sect, until he reached a point where he couldn't hold it in anymore. Remembering his friend, he said he might go against the principles of that sect and hoped he wouldn't be upset. With his answer ready, he told the master that he wasn't thinking of anything too grand. He wishes to do things as his own master once desired, filling the position he left in that place. He wants to surpass his master's achievements, for that is the true duty of a disciple. But the truth is, our boy will do whatever he wants. Yet his words were convincing to the master, who was deeply impressed after hearing them, understanding why he sees Hyunjo in that boy. It's not a matter of talent. He truly inherited his master's will. This path will be very difficult, as creating a new martial art is no easy task. But with that brief conversation, the master was sure of one thing: the boy will succeed. Laughing heartily, he said he was proud of him, and he was certain that wherever Hyunjo might be, he too would be proud of his disciple. That master had been very worried about this boy, but after that conversation, he began to feel great hope sparked by the determination in his eyes. The fragrance of the plum blossom will be far stronger in the future. He had not been able to protect the young buds during the attack. He should have been the flower to fall from the tree. Even after that attack, there are still small peels with great potential, and the master's task is to contribute to that. And he told our protagonist that there are many other flowers on that mountain. Then he decided to ask our boy if he knows why that clan chose the plum blossom. And the master said the boy would learn a great deal if he began to reflect on that. Rising from the table, he revealed that he would like to speak further with that disciple, but he believed he had already taken too much of his time. Thus, he began to leave that room. Before he could go, he said he was forgetting something he wanted to tell him. The master was once a disciple himself and lost his own master. He cannot fully understand the boy's sorrow, even if it is similar, because people feel things in different ways. But life and death are part of life. It is the natural flow of things. He advised our protagonist not to dwell on grief, but to see it as a new beginning and try to understand it as a way to celebrate life. Our boy realized that this was excellent advice. Trying to celebrate life is not bad at all. So he thanked the master for sharing his wisdom with him. Thinking about the plum blossom, he began to remember his past life, when one of his seniors said that our protagonist's body was far too fragile. He would not tolerate that kind of insult, and the senior replied that he was arrogant, an excellent quality for someone who wants to grow stronger. He shared with our boy that he had discovered a new way to train and asked if he would like to test it. The next day, our protagonist was hanging from a tree while carrying weights with his legs. The less conditioned the body, the more effective that training method is. He never imagined that crazy senior could be useful one day. That way of training is brutal, but it works. While he was focused on his training, another disciple appeared. Bringing him news, he said it was not the time to be training, because a very important time had arrived, but our boy had no idea what it could be. And that girl said that the leader of the sect assigned our boy a journey down to the foot of the mountain. The clan leadership was gathered in a room, discussing the situation of the third-generation students. They needed to open this class soon, but everything became difficult after the massacre. One of them suggested accepting disciples from other sects, to show the community that they were doing well, and the master agreed with that. One of them said they should also send a disciple to an outer sect in Shaanxi. He was certain that the Unorthodox Alliance or some other evil organization was trying to fill the power vacuum left in that place. Outer sects are those that are not on that mountain, and they depend on the main sects for recognition. Because of the heavy blow they suffered, the outer sects connected to them must be very anxious and worried. The master thought of sending a disciple to see how things were on the outside, and then they began to think about who could be sent. But for him, the answer was obvious. They were so busy they couldn't waste time on this kind of matter, so this issue needed to be resolved immediately. He shared with all the leaders that he would like to send his second-year student for this task. Some of the masters there were concerned because the outside of the mountain could be a complete mess. Someone suggested they should take more than one talented student for this, and one of the leaders asked if the master was referring to the 3 flowers. And that same man said they should send Mugwai as well, since that wouldn't be a problem. But as soon as our protagonist's name was mentioned, a great silence filled that meeting room. The elder who had treated his wounds was worried, but the master assured them that the boy had recovered in the past month. He was certain that he would be perfectly fine. The meeting continued with the leadership, and now we are in the city of Posen. Our boy went there with 3 other companions, and he was impressed with that city. That place was small and not particularly notable, but he was sure they must sell some strong drinks there. That was when his friend was impressed by something and asked him to see it too. It was a recipe made with chicken. She never imagined that this could become such a tasty ingredient. That was very different from what they ate back on the mountain. Distracted by the food, another colleague asked Manhwa to keep her composure. She said she would, but she kept getting distracted by the smell of the food in that place. It seems our protagonist found something interesting, and Manhwa kept completely distracted, seeing all that variety of food, until someone bumped into her shoulder as she wasn't looking forward. Very surprised by what had happened, she decided to look back, realizing that the man did not look friendly. The students were being watched by some locals. One of them was about to make that man apologize, but our protagonist interrupted him. That man noticed by their uniforms that they must be second-year students, and this was certainly their first time in the city. That man did not like having bumped into the girl, and he asked if they didn't teach basic manners in that place. She said she was not responsible for what happened, and our boy realized that, judging by those people's clothes, they must be connected to some sort of criminal organization. Maybe they were already trying to seize power in that place, since after the massacre everything fell into chaos. Even so, it was quite bold to try to confront those students. For this to be happening, they were certainly being influenced by someone more powerful. But that didn't matter. Our boy didn't think this was a problem. They needed to learn how to deal with troublesome people, and this was a great opportunity to do so. While the girl was talking, one of the men began staring intently at her body. Without him noticing, a sword approached his face. It was millimeters away from piercing his eye. That was when our protagonist asked that man where he was looking. Everyone was very surprised by that hostile gesture, and our boy said he had known from the start that they were the ones who bumped into her. He wanted to see how they would act in that situation, as this was their first time in the city, but that man had gone too far, and now he had started a fight with the entire Manhwa sect. Now he understood how the underworld of that city saw his clan, which surprised that thug as they had been exposed, and he thought he should do something about it. Becoming far more polite, he began to apologize, but our boy said he would not accept words from a worm like him. So if he didn't want the other fool to lose his eye, he should shut his mouth and get out of there. And from the look in our protagonist's eyes, that thug realized this was no bluff. It didn't take long for them to start running desperately, because if they stayed, it would be very dangerous. The girl apologized to our protagonist for what happened, but he assured her that she was the victim and didn't need to do that. Knowing that everyone must be shaken by what happened, he suggested they should find a place to rest a bit and eat. The girl, who was already very hungry, liked the suggestion, and they all began chatting casually. The other talented boy in the group was reflecting. His action had been very different from our protagonist's. Even without knowing what had happened, he had tried to suggest that Manhwa apologize, because all he was thinking about was ending things cautiously, and he forgot that they should also know how to stand up to those thugs who despised the sect. And he realized that our protagonist understood what was happening, being fully aware of what was going on around him at all times. But the truth is, our boy already regretted not having driven his sword into that man, and the talented boy realized that he needed to keep pushing himself, so things like that wouldn't happen again, because he didn't want his companions to be disrespected by anyone. As soon as they found a place to eat, this boy tried to pay attention to what was happening around him, but when he did, he ended up with a not-so-friendly expression. After some time, they all managed to eat plenty, and they were satisfied. Our protagonist became concerned about his companions, noticing that they were eating less. This could be a sign they weren't training much, but they assured him that wasn't the case. Manhwa wanted to know what they should do now. It would have been much easier if the clan master had revealed their mission, but his orders had been very vague. Our boy asked if anything noteworthy had happened that day, and she remembered that someone had tried to cause trouble with them. Then they rented some rooms and had that meal. Then she remembered the city's underworld, and that the master had given them authority to make their own decisions. And our protagonist didn't have much patience. He wanted to teach those thugs a lesson, sending them on a one-way trip to find out if God exists. Night finally fell over the city. After a long deliberation, our boy wanted to know what Mujin thought of his idea. He believed they should gather more information before starting to act. Then our boy asked what the others thought of that. Everyone agreed that gathering information was a good idea, and our protagonist's team is carefully observing those people, because our boy ordered them to gather as much information as possible before the next day's sunset. Two men approach a woman. They seem to be harassing her. These are the criminals from that city's underworld. People from the underworld are quite different from those who belong to unorthodox sects, and from demonic forces. And that thug told the woman that the calculations were done and that the interest rate had increased greatly. He had forgotten to mention that, and the woman seemed not to understand. The bald man said they needed to collect the money now, and it was his fault for not having mentioned it before, but if she didn't have the money right now, she could pay in another way. These bandits only seek to ruin people's lives, exploiting the weak. Assassins are also part of this, since they only do their jobs for money. The difference is they do only that. For ordinary people, underworld thugs are truly dangerous, since they seek only personal satisfaction. Our boy was still impressed with what had happened earlier, and approaching those thugs, he said he couldn't understand that. That was when they noticed the boy was approaching. Not knowing who our boy was, one of them began complaining loudly, because he had ordered his partner to watch the place. Little did they know that this poor soul was already on a one-way trip to feed the worms. Our boy asked who they thought they were to behave like that, and if they had someone protecting them from retaliation. Unwilling to give him the answer he wanted, the bandits asked if the boy wanted to start a fight, because if he didn't want to be destroyed in that place, he should leave as quickly as possible. Our boy lowered his hood over his face, saying that he had come there to gather information. But the bandits kept ignoring him, and one of them went back to what he was doing, until our protagonist surprised one of those fools by introducing him to his right knee. The poor guy's body flew several meters. It was so sudden that the bald man was left speechless, wondering what our protagonist was doing. The answer came in the form of another strike. After jumping, our boy landed on the ground with the sole of his foot on that poor guy's face, who now had lost consciousness. At that moment, the bald man realized his situation was getting complicated, and the woman tried to run away from him. That was when our protagonist drew the bald man's attention, and using all of his accumulated common sense, he decided to obey. Imagining that the bald man might know some martial arts, he told him to try attacking with killing intent. Only then could he spare this incompetent man's life. As if that weren't enough, he also demanded that he hand over everything in his wallet. Elsewhere in that same city, a drunkard was suffering the effects of alcohol-induced dehydration. At a table near him, his companions asked if all he did was piss all day long. If he kept taking so long, they'd soon be sober. As soon as he finished his business, the old man said he'd be back. As he walked back toward his companions, he didn't notice that there were some people tied to that tree. When he arrived at the table, they resumed talking. It seemed one of them wanted to show something funny he had found. It looked like someone at the table next to them had ordered a huge amount of food, but then left right away. Inside the city, Manhwa was talking with people to gather information. Sheol, on the other hand, was spying on suspicious-looking people. All the disciples seemed very dedicated to the task assigned by our protagonist, and on the outskirts of the city, some wrongdoers were gathering. One of them complained that the place smelled like food. They took that as an offense, not knowing where that person might have gone, that they could no longer hold back. As they began to approach that hooded man, they decided they would take all the food he had. But that mysterious presence revealed that he was not defenseless, for he was carrying a very sharp sword. Looking at those wretches, this man said he was not there to share his food, and if they tried to take it, he would cut off their heads. That was when the leader of those people decided to introduce himself, saying that the young master was truly oppressive. He began to apologize on behalf of all of them and said his name was Jinga, leader of the beggars' sect. Sheathing his sword, our protagonist also introduced himself formally. He was Muhui of the Dumont Manhwa sect. The leader of the beggars said he also lamented what had happened in the massacre and regretted that he could not help. Our boy said it was all right because that had been bad for everyone. Now that they had introduced themselves, the beggar leader wanted to know what that boy was doing in his territory, and our protagonist said he had come to gather information. Assuring them that the food wouldn't taste as good if it got cold, he said that was why they needed to eat while they talked. It didn't take long before they were savoring what our boy had brought. He soon discovered that those bandits belonged to Brutal Blood, a faction that had tried to seize power in that city due to the imbalance caused by the massacre. The beggar said everyone in that faction used martial arts. Our protagonist knew that because he had dealt with some of them. But he still hadn't addressed the most important thing, which made the beggar leader curious. Our boy wanted to know who was behind that Brutal Blood faction. That left the beggar leader quite surprised because the boy was assuming there must be a thinking head behind those brutes. And our protagonist said that region wasn't small and their sect was fairly large, and even so, their power had already been taken. Because of all those factors, it was very unlikely that a small organization could take control so quickly. What usually happens in a scenario like that is several small organizations start fighting for power, splitting that entire region, and the beggar was impressed with our boy's discernment. It was hard to believe he was just a rising talent, revealing that he hadn't told this to a boy yet, not because he wanted to hide the truth, but because he wasn't sure about it. He told him not to be surprised, but there's a martial artist who always contacts the Brutal Blood faction, and they belong to the Guryu Sword sect. That put our boy on alert, for that is one of the 3 great sects of the Shaanxi region. It is also close to the 2 largest among the 10 sects, but they had never cared about Manhwa or the Zongnan sect, and numerically, they were far more numerous. But it was still looking very suspicious. It did make sense for Gyu to hide their ambitions. Perhaps they couldn't even focus on a region like that. And the beggar leader stressed that he couldn't say for sure that the mastermind behind all of this was someone from the Gyu sect. And before he finished, Our boy said they wouldn't care about appearances. Besides, there was no concrete evidence about this, so they already had doubts about that Sect's involvement. Looking at the beggar leader, he said he'd like to know who that martial artist was, and the beggar realized he hadn't shared that information. He believed it was the Red Wolf Sword. Our boy seemed to recognize that name, asking if it was really him, and after confirming the information, the beggar leader noticed that the boy had already heard that name. Even without knowing what he planned to do, he recommended that he be very cautious. While reflecting on that name, our boy began to wonder who that martial artist could be, because the truth is he had never heard that name in his entire life. Morning dawned over that city, and our boy was looking out the window. He was thinking about everything they had done the day before. Although he had managed to gather some information, he still couldn't say who the Red Sword Wolf was. He'd also remembered that the night before he had tried to drink a little alcohol, because that beggar had been serving tea. As soon as he asked for some, he was given the water that birds don't drink, hoping that with that he could get more information. He only wanted to drink a little to follow through with his plan. The problem was that he stumbled on a variable he hadn't considered. The taste of that wine was simply exceptional. Even the beggar chief noticed that the boy had enjoyed it. Our protagonist said it had been a long time since he had tasted something so interesting, which made the beggar believe that it was his first time. That marked the end of his investigation. He dedicated himself to drinking, as he hadn't expected to find something so delicious. That is why he didn't get the information he wanted. Even so, he already had enough to form some suspicions. Now it remained to see what choices his team would make. Since there was still plenty of time that day, he decided to amuse himself with the wine that was left. As soon as his team arrived at that place, everyone had the same thought. It smelled like alcohol in there. Then our boy asked them to pay attention, because he wanted to know everything they had discovered in that city. Before giving the information, the girl said he shouldn't be drinking while they were working. Our boy was categorical in saying he hadn't done that, but he didn't seem convincing. Changing the subject, he said he wanted to know what they had discovered. One of them found out that the criminal underworld now dominated that city. Because of the massacre, they used that opportunity to take control. The girls said they were all bastards who oppressed the poor in that place, stealing money and committing other crimes, abusing violence at every opportunity. Keel continued. The biggest problem was that they were martial artists. Even if low-level ones, it was still very dangerous for those who couldn't defend themselves. Our protagonist liked what they had done, emphasizing that even though time was short, they had worked very well. Now he would share what he had discovered. Everything they had said was true. Later, he also confirmed this information, but there was something they needed to pay attention to. How had those bandits learned martial arts? Third-level techniques are not hard to learn, and it's easy to get books that teach those techniques. But those bandits were not the kind of people who would ever touch a book in their lives. Some even use books as firewood. So it is entirely possible that someone is helping those bandits. Our boy decided to look for who that person was. He managed to discover a pseudonym, but he didn't know their true identity. His companions wanted to know who it was, and our boy shared the name he had heard, the Red Sword Wolf, who belongs to the Nine Hells Sect. As soon as they heard this, one of his companions realized they were dealing with criminals who were a bit more dangerous. Our protagonist wanted to ambush and finish them all off, but for that, he needed his team's opinion. Some were hesitant, since those criminals were associated with a dangerous sect. Kievel said he didn't know why they were collaborating, the bandits and the sect, and because of the danger, he thought they shouldn't decide on their own. It would be better to tell the elders. And our protagonist wanted to know if he truly believed that. The girl said she agreed with our protagonist. They couldn't ignore all that injustice. They needed to do something for the people of that city. Mujin started to get worried because he wanted to avoid greater danger. He thought they should consider the situation. They were already recovering from that brutal massacre, and facing another sect because of those problems could be disastrous. So he told our protagonist that he considered that approach very dangerous. If they were only dealing with bandits, it would be a matter of minutes. But if the Nine Hells sect was behind it, he feared it could start a war. Our protagonist understood his concern but thought he was exaggerating. A war would not happen. Mujin wanted to know how our boy could be so sure about that, and he said that wasn't the Nine Hells way of operating. They are a very tyrannical organization. If they wanted to eliminate someone, it would simply start a war. They wouldn't act in the shadows as they were doing now. Not to mention that Manhwa was already very fragile. They could be invaded and destroyed at any moment. The truth is that most likely the Nine Hells don't have the time or resources to care about them right now. Very possibly the bandits were not even associated with that sect, and even if they were, a war was unlikely. He hoped Mujin understood, but the boy only had more questions. He asked where our protagonist had gotten all this information and whether it was truly reliable. Our boy said he had learned all of it through the beggar's sect. That left Mujin very surprised. He knew that was an orthodox sect made up of those relatives who lived on the streets. They were also the most numerous in all of Murim, using their numerical advantage to gather information, earning food and money in the process. Despite being poor, they knew martial arts and followed their own ethics and moral order. Of one thing he was sure: any information that came from those beggars was absolutely trustworthy. Mujin recalled some words he had heard from our protagonist, who promised he would try to solve this peacefully before resorting to a violent solution. Realizing he was worrying too much about that matter, he decided he would calm down. While they were discussing, our boy warned everyone they had arrived. Before they could react, our protagonist broke the wooden gate in front of them. Watching all that unfold, Mujin realized that peace was not an option, and inside, the men in that place were shocked and frightened because someone had destroyed the gate, asking who those intruders were. Our protagonist said it was very good that everyone was gathered there, and they should send a message to the Red Sword Wolf and their leader. They should come there to kneel and apologize. If they did things that way, maybe their lives would be spared. The men began to gather near our protagonist group, and one of them managed to recognize the symbol on their uniforms. Identifying them as disciples of Manhwa, Mujin was telling our boy that this was not a peaceful approach, while he tried to teach everyone that breaking gates like that was the way things were done in Django. Until a man who seemed to be the leader of those bandits stepped forward, asking what was causing so much commotion. One of the bandits told him those people seemed to be from the Manhwa sect. That ended up making that man very worried. It didn't take long for him to notice they were only 4 young people. They were far too confident, and he asked our protagonist group if they wished to die trying to ambush them late at night. He said he was receiving an important guest and would let that offense pass, but our boy replied that they were the ones who would die that night. He told the man to watch how he spoke to him because it could cost him his life. The bandit said our protagonist must be out of his mind, asking if he knew who they were affiliated with. He then ordered his men to show those kids how terrible bandits could be. They all began to draw their weapons. They advanced toward our protagonist group in a dangerous way. It was at that moment that Manhwa saw something she wished she hadn't. Some people had been executed in that place, and judging by how the bandits behaved, they must have been innocent. She was utterly shocked by that sight, and she ran toward those bodies, leaving her companions worried. The girl did that hoping to find some kind of solution, but there was nothing that could be done to save those lives. Completely unaware of the carnage that was about to begin in that place, the girl stood frozen on the ground, leaving her companions visibly distressed. Because near her, 2 bandits were preparing to end her life. What they didn't expect was that this girl reacted brutally, using an open palm strike that sent them flying. Those bandits, with their poor martial skill, couldn't withstand that attack. Before her, they were nothing but simple ants. Mujin and Sheol managed to get close to her safely, and at first began to scold the girl because she shouldn't have strayed away so recklessly. She said those people were in very serious condition and needed treatment immediately. One of the bandits began to get up, saying they wouldn't be taking those beaten people. He began telling his comrades that those intruders might be martial artists, but they were weak, and they could win if they united. The bandit leader saw all the commotion, but our protagonist didn't move away from him. Our boy noticed that Manhwa had attacked without using all her power, just as she did in training, and shouting from where he was, he began to reprimand her, saying a sword is not for decoration. She needed to kill those scum. The bandit leader started mocking our boy for not leaving his place to help his subordinates. Looking at his expression, it seemed like he was bored with the situation. In truth, our boy was frustrated with his team's performance. The bandit decided he would help his men kill the others and then finish off our protagonist, because his instinct told him that one must be stronger. Our boy didn't know why he had been left alone, but he didn't care. This was the situation he wanted from the start. It was the first time his companions were in Django, and they didn't know how things worked beyond the Sect walls. Mujin was having some difficulty. Someone threw mud toward his eyes. He managed to defend himself, but right after, he was hit by a kick. Our boy knew his companions weren't used to that kind of attack because these people truly wanted to take their lives. Things were different now. It wasn't like the massacre, when the first-generation disciples were there to protect them. This time, they would have to fight for real. If there wasn't determination in their strikes, they would end up dead. Mujin was on the ground and had to block a sword strike to preserve his own life. This was completely different from training. They needed to learn that life and death aren't decided by martial skill alone. Looking at Sheol, our boy reached other conclusions, because he seemed to be handling the situation very well, defeating several of the bandits. While holding one of them by the head, an enraged bald man decided to attack him. Sheol dropped that bandit's body to the ground, and the edge of the sword was already aimed at him, but he managed to block that strike, spinning with a powerful blow that crushed the bald man's face. That was enough to make him fall unconscious at the feet of the bandit leader, who began to panic, realizing that Sheol was getting closer and closer to him. That young man was definitely threatening. Our boy noticed the bandit leader was walking back toward him. He believed he had been wrong, assuming our protagonist was the weaker opponent and he would defeat the weakest first. There wasn't even time for a fight. The bandit leader was simply humiliated, and those who were still alive realized what had just happened. For they didn't know what to do in that situation, since all those enemies were truly formidable. An old man who had been watching all this said they could just choose another. He declared that whichever bandit killed those intruders would be the new leader. Now they should stop being dramatic and finish the job. That was the Red Sword Wolf. Now our protagonist team knew exactly who they were dealing with. Our boy looked at that man and said he had been expecting him to appear. As soon as he was called by his title, The old man was surprised. He hadn't imagined those youths knew him. He said he was honored by that, but our protagonist quickly corrected him. He said he'd only learned of his existence the day before, making it clear he wasn't all that famous. Besides, he didn't bother to learn the name of every weakling he met. The old man said that a disciple of an orthodox sect should adhere to tradition, but that boy talked like someone from a demonic cult. He then threw his cup to the ground, and stepping into that battle stance, he said our protagonist would have to bear the weight of his own words. Even in the face of that man's challenge, our boy remained completely calm. In the blink of an eye, he was already behind the old man, asking if he was strong enough to oppress him. The red sword demon turned around, trying to understand what had happened, but was brutally struck on the edge of the ear, falling to the ground immediately after. He used the inertia of the impact to spring to his feet, flipping backward, while trying to understand how that young man could be so fast, because he hadn't been able to see that figure move at all. And worst of all, his enemy hadn't even begun to use his sword. Trying to calm himself, he began to believe that young man couldn't possibly be on a higher level than him. There had to be some explanation, and our boy thought there was no reason to spare that man's life. But he would take this opportunity to test his own swordsmanship. It had been a month since he had taken control of that body. Since then, he had never stopped training, trying to perfect his technique with that of the Sect. He had not yet been able to prove the effectiveness of his research. His team was not strong enough yet, and the elders and first-generation disciples had no time for him. That's why that enemy was so precious. Even though she was far from his expectations, it was still a training opportunity, and the old man leaped into the air ready to attack our boy. He came down on him with a deadly strike, but our boy dodged it with great ease. Another strike followed, this time a horizontal slash. But all of that was far too slow for our protagonist. He took advantage of that huge opening to strike the old man's chest with an open palm blow, and he managed to push him several meters away. Before his enemy could even recover, our protagonist kept up the pressure at every instant. The old man realized he had almost lost a piece of his head. On top of that, all his movements were being intercepted, while he himself saw almost nothing. That was more than enough for him to realize there was a huge difference in levels there. But his pride kept him from believing the obvious. Taking an offensive stance, the old man acknowledged our protagonist as something far beyond a mere young prospect and apologized for underestimating him. He said that from then on, he would use all his power. He began to run furiously toward the boy, but our protagonist showed no reaction at all. That old man was able to conjure a beast with his inner energy. Our protagonist's team became very worried at that sight, but all he did was cut through that creature using a basic Hua Sect technique, completely destroying the energy strike, telling the old man that it was very fierce, but also full of openings. And judging by the execution he had just witnessed, the old man hadn't even been able to fully master that technique. Completely speechless, the old man tried to ask how the boy knew that, but the answer came to him in the form of several strikes. One of them managed to graze his arm superficially. That left the old man very confused because he was sure he had blocked them all. Now he didn't know if it was the sword illusion technique or simply a strike far too fast. Without him noticing, the strike passed right at the level of his jaw. Everyone was left speechless at that scene. A few strands of hair fell, along with a reasonable amount of blood. That old man, who already had a bizarre appearance, looked even more ridiculous, receiving an unusual haircut. But he had enough skill to notice that our protagonist had turned his sword at the last moment, so as not to cut his head off. Realizing that he had been acting like that since the beginning of the fight, the boy was going easy on him. Even though he didn't know the reason that motivated our protagonist, the old man became curious about something else. He wanted to know how someone so young could be so powerful. Thinking that maybe he was just a talented person, he started to get furious. He said that the talented are usually all alike, and he couldn't accept that our boy was better than him, who had lived far longer. Saying that he was a martial artist of the 9 hells, he unleashed another devastating inner energy attack on our protagonist. Those beasts were getting closer and closer, and once again, all of them were contained with just a single move from our boy, which was strong enough to reach that old man. Heel watched that last exchange between them in great surprise. The old man had been defeated. Before that boy was even born, he had been training, and he had continued on that path so that one day he could be recognized among the best. But his decades of training amounted to nothing before that anniversary. Knowing that his effort wasn't recognized left him furious. But our protagonist had no time for monologues from secondary characters, so he made sure to cut him down immediately. A poor man has his face buried in the ground. Slowly his fingers begin to move, and the young man stands up in shock, his mouth full of dirt and his mind very confused. He starts coughing and spitting it all out, feeling a huge pain in his head, having no idea what had happened. He remembers swinging his sword in that place and hearing someone complain that his efforts were not recognized. So he went to see what was going on, seeing that all his subordinates were being defeated. At that moment, the man realized it would have been much better to have remained unconscious. There is nothing more unfair in this land than having talent, and now his efforts have been surpassed by a younger, more talented prospect, even though he has only had a few years of training. Lying on the ground, the old man began to muse about the situation, thinking that it must be very good for that young man to be a martial artist in his sect. He had already met many such people in his life, But our protagonist is already recognized by those around him, and he must certainly have felt good defeating an enemy like the old man. He said he should enjoy that feeling, since one day he would end up dying just like him. When the Sword of the Nine Hells confirms his death, it's only a matter of time. It doesn't matter if he's talented. But for our protagonist, this old man just can't shut his mouth even on his deathbed. Approaching him, he turned his body over with a kick, and after hearing those words, realized there was a very deep sense of inferiority in that old man. Seeing the marking on his chest, he understood that he was a member of the Otherworld unit. Although there are the 3 axes that support the Swords of the Nine Hells, that's not what this is about. The Otherworld unit currently has no merit and is already out of the chain of succession. The real power lies in the Despair unit, which is at war with the Brutal Dragon faction. So our protagonist began to grow curious, wondering why these factions were interested in that region, and after thinking for a bit, he reached a conclusion. The mission that the Otherworld unit received in this war was to protect that garrison. However, since they sought recognition for themselves, they merely pretended to be carrying out their missions when in fact they were doing nothing. The old man was impressed that the young man had figured it all out, and our protagonist continued, saying that if the old man died now, the Otherworld unit would do nothing. In fact, they would hide that it happened at any cost. The old man should have been supporting the war, but instead was doing that foolishness. So this is the perfect opportunity for the Hell unit and the Despair unit to attack the Otherworld unit. Furthermore, even if the Otherworld unit came to the protagonist's Sect seeking revenge, he is not afraid of that, since the weak inspire fear in no one. After all, even if they joined forces to pursue such an outcome, our protagonist faced the Sect of the Sword of the Nine Hells alone. At that moment, the old man realized his life should have already ended, and that other fool who woke up after the carnage had taken place witnessed it. He immediately began moving the dirt on the ground, covering his head again, burying himself like an ostrich, thinking that he hadn't seen any of it. However, our protagonist knows the coward is still there and pulled the man's head out of the ground, asking why he was still lying down, since they needed to resolve this quickly. Then he told our young master that he would do as ordered. Inside, there are many books. There's protection fees, bets, bribery, and the names of those who borrow money from those gangsters. At least they are organized. Now our protagonist wants to know if that's all the information they have. After getting the fool's answer, he said that the money they had obtained through criminal means would be returned to its rightful owners, and they would also put an end to the betting there. And all of this must be done today. Our protagonist asked if he had any complaints, and the gangster said that doing it all in one day might be a bit difficult. So our protagonist reminded him that he could solve their problem with the sword, making the gangster immediately change his mind. Our boy made one thing clear. The reason they are still alive is not out of mercy, since they are all trash that should be used as fertilizer for the land. However, if that happened, the victims would have no one left to hate, so death for them would be a reward, and their sins now weigh heavier than death itself. They only deserve to live to keep paying for their sins, and he hopes the gangsters understand this. He also made it clear that the leader of that faction must start working immediately. Then our protagonist asked his companions to make sure everything was happening as ordered. The girl asked what the senior disciple would do now, and our protagonist said he had an urgent matter to deal with. At first, the girl thought he was going out to drink, which offended the boy, asking if he really looked like a drunkard to her. And without thinking twice, she said yes. Even if she sees him that way, he asked that they keep supervision over those people. The boy realized that Manhwa was quicker to catch on to nuances than he had imagined. However, this time he is not going out to drink, and someone asked why he had asked him to stay there. Getting up, our boy said he didn't need to hide anything, since they can't hide things from his nose. He wants to go directly to where this treasure is, and in his past life, to get stronger, he sought rare opportunities, but had no sect to support him. An elixir in this world costs a lot of money, and since he used to be completely broke, he had to search for it himself. But these items are rare for a very obvious reason. It is no simple task to find them. And one fine day, while he was resting after training, he ended up finding a tuber, luckily 7 years after he began adventuring. This tuber he had obtained in his past life had a distinctive smell he would never forget. So the gangster took our boy to the place he wanted to reach, because he felt the smell was coming from there, and now that he's close, that fragrance is getting stronger and stronger. The gangster said that tuber is 200 years old, and they had acquired it by accident, since it was found that it had been stored there. He ended up forgetting about it because of the chaos, but was impressed that the boy had smelled it. After everything that happened, that tuber now had no owner. Our protagonist released the gangster to work and closed the door to that place. Martial organizations usually have a space where they can practice internal energy circulation, and our protagonist noticed that the environment was very reinforced, so there was no need to worry. In his past life, he consumed a 300-year-old tuber. However, one that's a bit younger will not be bad. Either way, it doesn't change the fact that it is still very precious, and he is eager to enjoy this experience. But his eyes ended up seeing something surprising. That 200-year-old tuber is much bigger than he was expecting. It is much larger than the tuber he ate in his past life, and his personal estimate is that it is at least 400 years old compared to the difficulty he had in gaining access to it in the past. Finding it this time was far too easy. He even feels a little guilty about consuming it all alone, and thought that the next good item he finds he will share with someone. While the gangster works, he felt something happen. For a brief moment he became concerned, then went to the window to see what happened, seeing a lot of dust inside the courtyard. And in the middle of that dust was our protagonist, who was feeling quite renewed. The gangster went to the young master to find out what had caused that noise. So our boy said it was nothing important, and asked if the old man had time for walks at that hour, since he should have plenty of work to do. Dismissing the gangster, he said he would check his work later, since he wanted to make sure the money had been returned properly. And the gangster realized the young man could be very rude when he wanted to. Moreover, that's not the only problem. Definitely that noise was something important, because he saw what happened to the building, but the gangster no longer cared about the destruction of that place. However, he is curious to know what the tuber might have done to that boy's strength. Several tiles are being laid out on the ground, and the gangsters continue to work hard under the cruel supervision of our protagonist's team. One of his companions asked if that bandit had time to rest, since the sun would soon rise. Through this wonderful motivation, the gangsters found the strength to keep working. Then a large amount of silver was offered to the innocents. They were having trouble accepting that the money had been returned after having been taken from them in a criminal manner. And all of this was being observed not only by our protagonist's followers, but also by the mustached beggar. Apparently the boy really had defeated the red sword wolf, and it had only been 2 days since he had access to this information. The beggar suspected that when the boy asked for this information, he wasn't a conventional person, but this was simply incredible. It seemed that the Manhwa sect had been hiding a dragon, and while he was observing our protagonist's companions, the beggar ended up being surprised by the man himself. Very surprised, the beggar was a little startled by the sudden appearance, and our boy said he had come there to have a drink, and the young master concluded that it would be fun to drink alone. Even the beggar, accustomed to living on the streets and not bathing, found it strange to be invited to get drunk so early. Realizing that the young master knew the subject, he asked him to lead the way. Then the boy told the beggar that the red sword wolf had become fertilizer for the land, that the problem with the bandits was solved, and that he was returning the money to the innocents. However, one problem remained: the underworld faction. They had adopted that lifestyle because they had no other way to survive, and if there was a way to rehabilitate them, he would like to use that manpower. So he asked the beggar if he knew anyone who could take them in. Even though they reverse in martial arts, the boy thought the beggar wouldn't have to worry about that, since he was planning to sever the ties between the beggars and the Dantians while he was there. The mustached man said the boy might have difficulty with that, but was always surprised when talking to him. There were some merchants he knew, so he assured our protagonist that he wouldn't need to worry about the underworld people, as the beggar would personally take care of the situation so they wouldn't cause more trouble, and he thanked him for everything he had done for the community, as he had given them a chance to live again. Changing the subject, he asked how long the boy planned to stay there. He said he still had to visit 2 other divisions, so he would stay 3 more days. He also learned that there were some forts near that city, and the beggar assumed the young man would deal with that situation. At Manga in that city, everything seemed quieter, and our protagonist showed a small flask to his team. They were very pleased with it, and the boy had prepared that bamboo liquor to congratulate his companions, who had worked very well. Then they said they didn't drink alcohol at all. Our protagonist knew this was the sect's custom, and that they only drank during special events or when there was something to celebrate. However, new prospects entering the city ended up dying on their first experience outside, and they must have realized that facing enemies willing to end their lives, yet they persevered. That was a brief demonstration of what the real world was like. Even if they were stronger than those underworld people, the difference between life and death isn't decided solely by technique, and those not used to it could meet a terrible end. Yet they were still alive. Their safety was the reason to celebrate. Our protagonist said that was the real reason why they should drink. Then the most dedicated of them asked if this wasn't the senior disciple's first time outside. Confirming this, they all decided to celebrate his victory over that city and realized that bamboo leaf liquor was actually delicious. Even though it was alcoholic, it wasn't so bitter. Now they all understood why the senior disciple was so familiar with drinks. If it were all as good as that, they'd drink every day. However, one of them kept thinking about our protagonist's movements. That sword technique wasn't part of the fencing technique he knew, so he began to think about it, since he needed to know the real answer, until he decided to ask our protagonist, revealing that he had observed his battle against the red sword wolf. That sword technique didn't seem like the one they learned in the sect, It was something he had never seen before. Its power was concentrated and the curves weren't so smooth, which is why he wanted to know more about that technique. Our boy thought his companions were too busy fighting and didn't expect to be observed by the strongman, and without a doubt, that sword technique contained the principle of weight mastery. The balance between weight and strength is what guided the fencing technique he had created in his past life. All he had done was apply the principle of weight to the basic movements of the Sect's technique, but he was impressed that the strongman had noticed it. Still, he didn't realize it was the same technique he already knew, so he praised him for being able to perceive it, but wouldn't reveal his secrets yet, because there was something they needed to do first. All he wanted was an opportunity to bring it up to his companions, and now the moment was perfect. But he asked if they had finished drinking, because after hearing his words, they wouldn't have time to drink for the next 3 days. A carriage made its way along the road, until the driver heard someone's voice asking him to stop. Confused by this, he saw the man approaching, and that stranger said it was nothing. All he needed to do was hand over everything he had, unless he wanted his life to end right there. While this approach was taking place, our protagonist and his friends observed carefully. The boy instructed everyone to remain hidden in the bushes until the situation was confirmed. That bandit seemed to be from the underworld, but they were technically different, as the biggest difference was martial knowledge and his systematic approach. They had already faced martial artists before, but that was because they had fought the Red Sword Wolf. So those bandits weren't the usual underworld type. These were a bit more structured, and if they encountered bandits, they should assume there was a fort nearby. Definitely, these ones were more dangerous than the underworld bandits, which left the girl a little worried. She asked our protagonist why he had said all that. The boy said that for the next 3 days, his companions would destroy all the forts in that region. Only one would attack the fort, while the others would just watch. They realized the order was quite challenging. Even more worried, the girl asked if this was a punishment and if they had done something wrong, which left our protagonist confused, since his companions had almost been defeated when they faced underworld bandits. This had happened because they weren't prepared to harm other people, and this task was so they could overcome that difficulty. The strongman agreed. If it hadn't been for the protagonist, it would have become fertilizer, so that task seemed interesting. Faced with this, the promising boy asked how our protagonist had prepared himself to take lives, but unfortunately, he couldn't tell the truth, that it hadn't been his first fight, since it had happened many years ago. Still, it wasn't something that could be easily forgotten. Our protagonist had been injured in the eye, and he was completely terrified, feeling that if he wasn't the one to kill, he would certainly be the one to die. He told his companions that he was afraid of dying and was also worried that his companions might end up as fertilizer, so he defeated the enemy in front of him to prevent his fears from becoming reality. That was what had happened. Paying attention to this explanation, the promising boy seemed to have absorbed the lesson. However, as he stood up, our protagonist said that was just an example, since each one needed their own motivation to fight. He told the strongman something about that sword technique that had raised his doubts. He would finally learn it, but it all depended on his performance in this mission. It was everyone's first night, so our protagonist was going to show them how it was done. It was up to them to watch and learn. Quickly, the bandit was defeated, and our boy lifted the clown's face from the ground, and with a few slaps, woke him back up. That was enough for him to give up the information our boy was after. Now he had found the criminal's hideout. Many of them were intrigued by the presence of that boy, but it didn't take long before all of them had their stay in this land ended prematurely. Several bodies now decorated that place. Finally, the 3-day special training began. During the day, they continued supervising the brutal blood faction, and at night, they would have fun in the forest, searching for the forts. The training was proving very effective. In the beginning, they had been hesitant. It really was complicated to defend against aggressive people. However, they learned something fundamental. Once the hesitation was gone, defeating enemies became very easy. Still, not everything was perfect. It seemed the promising boy needed a bit more time. It wasn't technique he lacked. In fact, he was far superior to his companions. Yet there was still hesitation in his sword, a sign that he feared hurting his enemy more than being hurt himself. However, there was nothing our protagonist could do about that, because it was a difficulty the promising boy had to overcome on his own. Finally, they cleared that region of bandits a day earlier than planned, and our protagonist praised everyone's work, stating that they would depart soon, and until then, his team should rest. Faced with this, the girl asked what they would do today, and our protagonist replied that he would teach his sword technique to the strongman. The others would also have this free lesson, to the displeasure of the girl who wanted to rest a little. Immediately, our protagonist began performing strikes with his sword, leaving deep marks on the ground. His companions were impressed to witness it. Then the boy said that the technique they had just seen was a movement they already knew. All he had done was add a little more weight. The strongman was quite intrigued by this. This was the next step of that technique. Even if the sword's path was blocked or disrupted, it was because small changes had occurred in the movement, but also due to the difference between defense and attack in the combination of the 6 paths. In other words, they could add other skills to that movement. From now on, he would show his personal interpretation of it, but he asked what would happen if he added illusion to the sword's path. The strongman grew more and more curious, and apparently our boy realized they had understood the message. The first to do this was his master, the sword saying of that sect, a sign that he had deep knowledge of martial arts, since he taught many things about the combination of the 6 strikes, arriving at a conclusion. The pedals and other techniques still belonged to that initial movement of the 6 strikes. So the sword saying had been gradually developing a new technique, and all he did was add a little weight to his sword, just as our protagonist had shown. However, it was still incomplete, and their sect did not possess a technique that deeply studied the weight of the sword. Learning something incomplete could only be done by those who master the basics, and there was a reason why the sword saint had kept it a secret. He knew very well that an incomplete technique could cause chaos and confusion. That was why our protagonist asked if his companions wanted to learn that technique. After thinking long and hard, the strongman said yes, for he was eager to grow stronger and stronger. Right after that confirmation, the strongman's training began. What was bizarre was that they stayed in the same spot until the sun rose. Meanwhile, the girl was wondering how much longer they would have to wait until she decided to ask the promising boy a question. She suggested they flee immediately, but our protagonist advised them not to, since up until now they had been wielding the sword using the principle of illusion, and they should forget what they had learned and imagine that the true core of that technique was the principle of weight, thinking about the difference between these 2 sword techniques. That was exactly what the strongman was doing now. While he trained, the girl and the promising one said they would supervise the underworld bandits and then rest. Inside the city, a man hurried his servant, complaining that these men were far too slow. Meanwhile, the girl observed the city and saw nothing wrong. According to our protagonists, some people became bandits because they had no other option in life, and they would change if they had the chance. But the girl didn't believe it. She thought they were just trash, or perhaps they were only behaving because they were being watched. But she didn't worry about them, since they were all weak. The promising student was probably also supervising the bandits at that moment. So the girl decided she would end her work now and start her long-awaited rest. Since she had been working a lot lately, she was going to dedicate herself fully to her relaxation session. But before that could happen, she heard someone try to speak to her. Startled, she immediately reacted by drawing her sword, but was surprised by what she saw. She recognized the person from the brutal blood faction who had been saved by them, and she apologized, saying she hadn't meant to scare her. Clinging to her hand was a small child. This was her younger sister. Immediately, our girl sheathed her sword and said she was a bit on edge from working so much. She was surprised to hear the woman's thanks and immediately felt embarrassed. She wondered if this was what knights felt when they saved someone. Feeling as if she might cry, the woman said that thanks to her, they had been able to hold her father's funeral. Our girl hadn't known that detail. Then she remembered there had been a man with that woman and now realized he hadn't survived. She apologized for not having been able to help them better and hoped their father could rest in peace. However, the woman said apologies were unnecessary. She had come only to thank her, because thanks to her, her sister had been saved. The little girl also had something to say. She said she planned to become a knight as impressive as the beautiful woman standing before her. The child's blow was super effective, and our girl immediately began to cry. Even the woman was confused, not knowing why her savior had become so emotional. Moved by the child's enthusiasm, our girl said she could become that one day and perhaps even stronger than her. Since she was already crying intensely, the woman asked if she was okay. Later that same day, nothing happened. It was now nighttime and the promising boy was in a room, seeming lost in his own thoughts. The next morning, the girl in the group was upset again. She said the protagonist was moving too fast and there was no reason to hurry. Our boy replied that actually it was his companions who were too slow and that they had relaxed too much after one day of rest. It seemed they were neglecting training, so if he would take a closer look at it. When asked why he had allowed them a day of rest, our boy looked firmly at the pretty one, and she immediately realized she might make this situation worse for everyone. On the other hand, the promising one wanted to know if the rehabilitation of the bandits was progressing properly. Apparently nothing had happened while they were there, and he asked this mostly to change the subject. But our protagonist said his companions should worry about the weak mentality they had, so the difficulty of training would be increased, and the promising boy realized he had failed to change the subject. They all thought the same thing, that their lives would definitely end here. On the way, the pretty one began talking about how she missed Young, the younger sister of the woman they had saved. She had run into her by chance in the city, and the child had said she wanted to become a warrior like her. And our protagonist realized it was the first time he had ever cared about the future of a young child. Before he could hear the pretty one's complaints, he ordered everyone to shut their mouths, because they had finally arrived at the city of Winan. Under the twilight glow, they could see the entire large village. There was an external sect of theirs called the Fresh Flower Sect, located in that city, and they were to dine there. Finally, they arrived at the headquarters building. Inside, some children were beating each other up, and apparently the victim being bullied had been pinned down. The brat was about to show him his secret techniques of childhood harassment, striking the poor silver-haired boy violently in the stomach. Not satisfied, he was about to strike again, but the hand of a responsible adult stopped it from happening, and began scolding the child for doing such a thing. Immediately, the little delinquent realized his situation. Oh, ChatGPT Dissy. There were a few adults there with him. Observing her clothes, the child who was being beaten realized something, They were disciples of the original Manhwa sect, and our protagonist said that such assaults could seriously injure a child who didn't know how to defend themselves. Apparently, this little delinquent must be aware of that. Even so, the young troublemaker didn't feel intimidated. Our protagonist noticed he had an arrogant look despite being young. The problem must be with the parents. The child had already been influenced by evil. It wasn't his fault. Thinking about this, he kept holding the young offender's hand. That was when our protagonist noticed something interesting. The brat wouldn't stop staring at him, and he said that if he kept doing that knowing it was wrong, he might end up getting slapped. Imagining that the boy belonged to an orthodox group, he asked who had taught him to act that way. And our protagonist was interrupted by the child who had been beaten, who pulled at his clothes. It seemed this boy suffered from Stockholm Syndrome. Our protagonist watched this child closely. Then he let go of the little delinquent's hand, telling him to leave before he made him go by kicks and punches. With the situation resolved, only the beaten child remained. He immediately made a polite bow. He said his name was Lin from the Fresh Flower Sect, and that he was grateful for the help. Our protagonist introduced himself. His name was Mui, from the second generation of Manhwa disciples. Very concerned, the pretty one wanted to know if the child was okay. And our boy asked who those delinquents were. The silver-haired child said they were from the Great Truth Sect, and the worst of them was the young leader. The rest were just lackeys who trained with him. The pretty one asked why the child was being bullied, and the boy said their sect had never been on good terms with the Great Truth Sect, and recently, they had found out they were stronger, which was why they had started beating him. The promising boy asked if the sect leader knew what was going on. The child said yes. He had even used to retaliate against the assaults. But then the leader of the Fresh Flower Sect went to complain about it, and things hadn't gone as expected. Apparently, the blame had been placed on the victim, and that conflict had almost turned into a sect problem. To avoid war, the Fresh Flower leader backed down. Our protagonist realized the situation could mean the end for them, and that the best choice was to opt for peace. That was why the child had asked for help without saying anything. Even at his young age, Lin was thinking about what a war could do to his father and accepted the harassment from the bullies. However, knowing that an external sect of Manhwa was being treated that way made the pretty girl upset. And our protagonist said there was a reason why they were sent to handle tasks like this. Now they would hear the details from the sect leader himself. Inside the courtyard, there were several disciples who were surprised by the arrival of our protagonist's team. The first thing he noticed in that place was that the disciples of the external sects wore white flowers on their uniforms, unlike the red ones of the main sect. Seeing that they had arrived, a man said they had been waiting for everyone. Introducing himself politely, our protagonist said he was a second-generation disciple and thanked them for the warm welcome. He was Lim Muvuk, leader of the Fresh Flower Sect. They had heard about what had happened with the brutal blood faction in a single night. Our protagonist said the rumors were a bit exaggerated. The sect leader asked if his son had been the one responsible for bringing those guests, and the boy confirmed it. He immediately praised the effort, inviting all the guests inside. Once inside, tea was offered to them. The strongman noticed it was very tasty, one of the best teas they had ever tried, and the sect leader replied that it couldn't be as good as Manhwa's. He said he had never forgotten the taste of the tea he had there, acknowledging that he should visit them soon. However, he thought he should let the youths rest, but our protagonist said they were there for work. He immediately asked how the Fresh Flower Sect had been doing in recent days. After a brief silence, the leader confirmed they were in a complicated position. Our protagonist wanted to know if this was due to the Great Truth's presence, and the leader said they had generally been on good terms, never having problems in the past. However, everything had changed after the Great Massacre, which the leader confirmed. Once they learned the extent of the damages suffered by the main sect, the Great Truth had begun acting arrogantly. Even the son of the rival sect leader was harassing his son, and apparently he continued to suffer. The leader also knew his son had tried to hide it, but as a father, he would eventually find out. Unfortunately, the Great Truth wanted the conflict to happen. They were trying to take over that area. Even as leader, there was nothing he could do for his son, as he also had responsibilities toward the disciples of that sect. Very concerned, the promising boy asked why he hadn't asked for help earlier, but the leader knew the situation was complicated for everyone. He would have waited for the recovery of the main sect, but he was happy those young people had come to his aid. He could feel their determination just by observing them. If they had come there voluntarily, it meant they were very willing. To our protagonist, it seemed the old man didn't believe in them, and those words left the promising boy quite confused. The truth was, our protagonist had noticed something. Lin had shown too confused an expression when he saw the man's son, and the protagonist's companions hadn't picked up on it. To change the subject, the old man said the boy was imagining things because not trusting the disciples was the same as not trusting the main sect, and there was no way an external sect leader wouldn't trust them. He would have liked to continue talking, but it was merely time for dinner, so he wouldn't keep his guests there. That left our protagonist frustrated, as he had offered to help, but his offer was refused. And he understood the old man. They had endured many trials and probably had high expectations of the disciples who would come there. But all he saw were children. It was hard to believe they could face an entire sect. They would surely end up hurt. Trying to protect them, the leader was only waiting to send them back safely. but things weren't easy. Even when he thanked his son, he felt much sorrow for what would continue to happen. That old leader had built up too high expectations for the help that would come, and he couldn't hide his emotions. However, he recognized that our protagonist was a good observer, and the boy told him he appreciated all the consideration, but they would be responsible for their own dinner that day. Hearing this, the pretty girl was very surprised by the lack of manners, but for our protagonist, it was the sect leader who had started with the lack of courtesy, and the old man asked why they were refusing his hospitality. Seeing he couldn't convince him, our protagonist said he couldn't accept it since he hadn't helped him. It wasn't right. A heavy silence filled the room. His companions couldn't understand it. They remembered everything he had taught them until now, and how cruel he had been. How firm his stance was with the bandits, striking first and asking questions later, and how he had earned everyone's admiration. It didn't even seem like the same person sitting in that room. Later that same day, the girl said our protagonist was behaving strangely. He had never cared much about his responsibilities, but now he valued them, so there must be a reason. While she kept pressing for an answer, our boy looked at them and, surprised, they were waiting to hear something. Now that they were far from that building, he said he would tell them the truth. The Fresh Flower Sect leader didn't trust them. The girl thought it unlikely the leader would do something like that. But our protagonist insisted that was the case and then asked what behavior the children of the other sect had shown toward them. The children might appear to know nothing, but a successor was still a successor, and had to be careful with their actions and words. And if you behaved that way, there had to be a reason for it. The great truth wasn't being cautious about their presence, and the Fresh Flower leader knew this because the main sect was going through problems and the protagonist group was made up of young disciples. If they ever enter into conflict, a defeat would surely be disastrous for the Fresh Flower sect. People would say Manhwa had failed to solve internal problems. That was the worst situation for everyone. Hearing this, the girl asked what they should do, and our protagonist already had the answer. The problems would only grow if they failed. That's why they were going to resolve this situation. Inside a restaurant, a man was eating some dumplings. Other people were calmly having their meals there. Our protagonist was with his team in that establishment. This was the Fresh Flower Sect's territory, but their rivals walked around there without a care. It was clear from their eyes that they were looking for possible victims ready to start a conflict. A man accidentally bumped into one of those punks. They exchanged brief glances, but this poor man was visibly drunk. Having bumped into a stranger, he apologized. Continuing on his way, he complained that the protection fee was too high and that those thugs looked at people like homicidal maniacs. Even though the great truth was an orthodox sect, it was still a problem. Our protagonist was surprised to learn they were charging protection fees in the Fresh Flower Sect's territory. Soon, several people began complaining about those leeches who never stopped draining the townspeople's money. Our protagonist listened closely to that outburst, realizing that the region had already been claimed by the Great Truth Sect, and the collection of protection fees was already bothering the city's citizens. Since that man was speaking loudly, it was only a matter of time before something happened. The boy told his team that the situation could be favorable, instructing them not to intervene no matter what happened. The girl didn't understand that recommendation. Then, a young man stood up, saying he couldn't listen to that anymore. He slapped one of the drunk men on the back, asking what he had just said, clearly doing it on purpose. The people in the restaurant watched the interaction, and the martial artist continued to show disrespect. The drunk asked what he was going to do and if he was ready to end his life right there. A man worried for the drunk said he was going too far. However, full of courage, the drunk replied that he hadn't said anything wrong. When the demonic cult was around, those bastards had been hiding in their holes, and now they roamed the city collecting fees. Unlike the Fresh Flower Sect, which at least protected the people. They were nothing like orthodox sects. In reality, they were an alliance of scoundrels. If he belonged to them, he'd be ashamed to walk in public because of such behavior. Finishing his statement, the martial artist shoved the drunk. As the man fell to the floor, he drew his sword, saying they weren't fools. Now the drunk would see what happened to people who insulted the great truth, but our protagonist quickly intervened. He threw his small wooden sticks, hitting the thug's shoulder. That immediately shifted the focus of the scene. Another lackey, ready to attack the protagonist, asked who he was. His answer came in the form of a brutal kick to the chest, sending the poorly drawn man's body flying. The remaining thug tried to intimidate our boy, saying he didn't know what he was doing. The protagonist immediately picked up the sword lying on the ground, asking how the thug dared to wield his weapon against someone who couldn't defend themselves. He had always thought there was no real difference between orthodox and unorthodox sects, but after this, it seemed he had been wrong. The thug realized our protagonist was from Manhwa, and with firm words, our boy asked what he thought he was going to do with that sword. Completely terrified, revealing himself to be a coward, he said he only intended to scare the drunk. Without him noticing, our protagonist took the sword from his hands, saying that from now on the sword belonged to him, since it shouldn't be in the hands of a fool who used it to oppress the weak. He also told him that he'd be able to move his arm again after removing the wooden spikes lodged in his shoulder. If he wanted the sword back, he'd have to come to the Fresh Flower Sect to get it. However, The man became furious at the insult to his sect, spouting all kinds of nonsense. Our protagonist looked at him with deep killing intent, saying that not even the leader of the Great Truth would dare speak like that, and it seemed he was treating Manhwa as nothing special. It was as if he was used to making such insults. Faced with this, our protagonist realized he'd have to take a harsher approach. There was only one way to earn forgiveness, and that was for the Great Truth's leader to personally visit the Fresh Flower Sect and beg for it. If he didn't come by sunset the next day, his entire sect would become history. The thug had better think carefully about his answer. Our protagonist finally returned to his companion's table. The girl noticed that he was becoming bolder and said it would have been better to ambush the Great Truth that same day. The others agreed. At night, they asked if everything would really be fine this way, clearly worried. The next day, the Great Truth's leader was doing as suggested. He came accompanied by several of his disciples. They were all approaching the Fresh Flower Sect. For the Fresh Flower leader, there had been 3 moments in his life when it felt as though a great boulder had been placed on his chest, making it hard to breathe. The first was when Manhwa had been attacked. That night had been bloody. Another time was when he lost his eldest son, and then lastly, when he learned his youngest son was being harassed. Now it was happening again, seeing those men approach his sect. Our protagonist was waiting eagerly for their arrival, and from the expressions of those people, it seemed they had no intention of apologizing. The leader of the thugs realized our protagonist was behind all this. It seemed he was an ill-mannered brat despite learning martial arts. If that was the first thing he said upon seeing our boy, it was because his actions had clearly bothered the thug leader. But he was no more polite than the lackeys present, who didn't even hide their desire to cause a massacre. They looked more like a demonic sect. The thug leader took offense, and our boy told them not to resolve it outside. It was better to go in and talk. Some might see it as a misunderstanding, and it seemed the thug leader was about to draw his sword immediately. But they weren't a demonic sect, and apparently were orthodox in name, so they should avoid unnecessary trouble. These words made the Great Truth leader pause. He said our boy was just a loudmouth, but thought he might be trying to stall for time. Even so, he decided to go in and talk, and what our boy wanted was for him to try to attack, so he could break several of his bones. Unfortunately, that wasn't going to happen now. The Fresh Flower leader told everyone to come inside. Even though he was very nervous, he felt things were unfolding just as our protagonist had said. As soon as he learned what our protagonist had done, he had panicked, since a conflict would be entirely unnecessary. Now he didn't know what to do, and our boy told the old man to calm down as he would explain his plan. He knew the man had no reason to trust the youths. When they had been sent to check on the external sects, the main sect leader hadn't given them any specific tasks. He had trusted their judgment and possible actions. He had told them which regions should be visited. Pozung, Huanan, and Lushan. Cities far too big for second-generation disciples to properly assess. Our boy said he would reveal something now that hadn't needed to be mentioned before. The Brutal Blood faction was connected to the 9 Hells, which was why he hadn't been able to avoid conflict with them. They had resolved everything in secret, so there wouldn't be unnecessary friction between the sects. Knowing this, the leader was very surprised that our protagonist had faced a 9 Hells martial artist without being injured. He was even more impressed to learn that our protagonist had handled it alone, without his companion's help. And just as the main sect leader had trusted our boy, he was now asking this old man to place his trust in him too. If he wished to confirm anything, it was best to ask now. He could even request a duel with our protagonist. But it seemed the old man was convinced. Faced with this, he asked if the boy was sure he could handle the Great Truth sect alone. The protagonist assured him that wouldn't happen, and even if a battle did occur, the leader shouldn't worry, because he alone was more than enough. Now the leader of the other arrogant ones was in the meeting. He carefully observed the silver-haired elder. For the Fresh Flower leader, humans were unpredictable, so they had to be cautious. Our protagonist knew there was a problem to be solved. However, those 2 factions had even deeper conflicts, and as a representative of Manhwa, he was inclined to resolve it in the best way possible. Since the situation was hostile, he got straight to the point, suggesting that each faction choose a representative to duel. The proposal made the elder of the Fresh Flower sect a little apprehensive, and the thug in front of him began laughing uncontrollably, asking Lin if he really wanted to trust this young boy. Once inside that room, he wondered what sort of tricks they were planning. What, if it was only a duel, it was truly foolish. Apparently, Lin had forgotten about the death of his eldest son. He surely hadn't told that story to the newcomer, and the one he had placed his trust in had ended up stepping on a fragile part of his past. Through a sound transmission technique, our protagonist asked if the old man's son had died in a duel against the Great Truth sect, and realizing he had touched an open wound, apologized for it. However, Lin acknowledged his own fault for hiding the truth, stating that he trusted our protagonist to continue making decisions. Faced with this, he kept his word regarding the duel, firmly agreeing to it and saying there would be 3 people on each side: the leader, the vice leader, and a strong warrior from each sect. And our boy stated that he would be the strong warrior for his own team and wanted to know if a 5-day deadline was acceptable to the thugs. Very confident, the leader of the Great Truth said they could do it right now, adding that in the last duel, people had accused his sect of deliberately killing someone. Yet in his opinion, the fault lay with the weak man who was no longer alive, and he didn't want to be called a murderer again. It seemed that Thug didn't even know how one of his men had gotten into conflict with our protagonist, and the villagers already referred to the Great Truth sect as a demonic sect, so he didn't need to worry about his reputation getting any worse. That only made the Thug even angrier. He even suggested our boy watch his words, because they could attack the Fresh Flower sect right then and there, and the only reason they hadn't yet was because they were interested in this proposal. That's when our boy realized he had irritated the old man, revealing that he only wanted to share something they seemed to have overlooked. One of the warriors accompanying the leader asked if our protagonist was stupid, since they were holding themselves back from turning that place to ashes. Hearing this, our protagonist looked at the extra with intense killing intent, and the man immediately had to tense the muscles between his waist and knees or else risk soiling his pants. It was then that the bigger thug joined in, agreeing to the 5-day deadline, hoping it would be a fair duel on both sides and that no lives would be lost. He immediately began leaving the room. With his departure, Lin let out a deep sigh. The young leader of the Great Truth was much weaker than his own son, and although in the past the leaders had similar strength, things were different now. Certainly, our protagonist would face a hired killer, asterisk. But the boy didn't care. Lin revealed that his trust in the young man remained unshaken and had a question. He wanted to know if acting this way was really fine for our boy. The protagonist assured him the duel would be very relaxing. With that, Lin said he would place all his trust in him, and standing up, our protagonist called the old man to go to the training hall. He didn't know if he could help in any way, but told Lin he should see himself as a dead man for the next 4 days. Outside, our protagonist's companions were uneasy. The girl asked the promising student if everything was alright, but he preferred not to answer, because he could see the sect leader working hard at his training, following our protagonist's rather cruel methods. The boy said it was far too soon to be tired. The old man needed to endure the suffering to prepare for what was coming. There was a sword beneath him, and our boy suggested the old man not fall, as it could be very unpleasant. Seeing all of this, our protagonist's companions reached an obvious conclusion. He was a demon. Even with help and training, Lin Jr. didn't believe he would get stronger in just 4 days. He kicked a small pebble toward our boy's feet, who watched the child closely. Lin Jr. was surprised to run into him, and our protagonist said the boy was right. As he had already heard, it wasn't possible to become stronger with just a few days of training, unless a miracle happened. However, this was only about refining martial technique in terms of experience. That was completely different. It was all about how one used the knowledge they had. Our protagonist said he had a question for the child. He wanted to know if the boy was using his martial technique properly, and at first the child believed he was. Taking that answer, the protagonist told him to follow, and holding the pebble, said it would be enough. The boy immediately asked what he should do, and our protagonist threw the stone far away, using it to break part of a tree trunk, leaving the poor boy completely stunned. The protagonist assured him that he had used less internal energy than a child his age should have. Besides, the child had claimed he used his techniques correctly, so he should be able to do the same. Looking firmly at him, our protagonist said it was time for Lin Jr. to demonstrate. If he succeeded, that day's training session would be over, but if he failed, he would have to keep trying. Night fell on that day, and the boy kept working hard. Marks covered the tree trunks in that area. It still wasn't the result our protagonist wanted to see, but he acknowledged the child had improved greatly, and since it was already late, they should rest a little. The poor boy fell to his knees looking at his badly bruised hand and came to an obvious conclusion. The man who had trained him all afternoon was a demon. The time had passed so painfully that the sun was already rising. There was no chance to rest. With the sun lighting the sky, our protagonist said the second day of training had begun, and since time was short, they would do it together. The previous day, they had learned to use their own bodies. Many would say there was a notable improvement in the old man's body. Since he had been consistent in his training, his body had recovered quickly. That was good, but they needed to move on to the next step. That day's training was about finding composure, and nothing was better than a practical demonstration. So our protagonist told them to watch closely. Looking at his companions, he ordered them all to take position. Lin and Lin Jr. thought he was about to fight all of them. The girl said she would go first, and the promising boy said he would be right behind her. They charged to attack. The first strike was blocked by our protagonist, who dodged the second and struck the pretty girl in the stomach, all while the promising boy was also closing in. But he soon got his share of training, and before he could land a hit, the strongman stepped in to save the day. Lin Jr. asked his father if that wasn't too dangerous, and the old man agreed, but said they should keep watching a bit longer. Quite nervous, the elder didn't know what the protagonist wanted to teach them. The hilt of the sword struck the promising boy's stomach, almost making him vomit everything he had eaten that morning. Our protagonist's sword still hadn't stopped, but it was blocked by one of the strongman's strikes. As soon as that happened, our protagonist noticed the strongman's sword had more weight than before, but it still wasn't enough. Overcoming his guard, he brought his blade to the strongman's neck, who realized he had lost. The pretty girl's attacks were far too obvious, making them easy to defend against. For the promising student, his strikes lacked violence, and the strongman needed to get used to this new technique. Our protagonist kept instructing his team, then returned to Lin Jr. and his father. This was how they would train until the day of the duel, but the old man was confused since he didn't understand the training method. He was right to notice something. Our protagonist asked if he hadn't felt something wrong during the fight, and Lin replied that it had seemed far too spirited to be just training. That was when he realized something incredible. The best way to improve in a short time was by accumulating experience, and that had to come through real combat. That way, he would certainly become capable of avoiding most of his enemies' attacks, so they should grab their swords right away. Their objective was to try to end our protagonist's life, treating it like a real fight, but the old man was worried for his son. It seemed, however, that Lin Jr. was very brave, and that day he threw dirt at our protagonist, leaving his father very surprised. If he was going to do that, he should do it the right way, so he immediately advanced with his sword, drawing it from its sheath, ready to surprise our protagonist, who managed to protect his eyes from the dirt. Before the boy could get closer, he was harshly repelled by a kick. Lin saw it happen, but it was too fast. When he looked forward again, the fight was already in progress, and our boy's sword had nearly taken off his head. However, the attacks didn't stop. Our protagonist kept attacking the old man, who was doing several flips to dodge. Now close to his son, he asked if he was alright. Lin Jr. said it hurt, but he only pooped a little, so he was fine. From behind them, our protagonist asked if they were planning to chat casually during a real fight. He said this was as real as it gets and threw a sword into the old man's hands. They needed to use everything they had, otherwise they wouldn't survive. The old man realized our protagonist wasn't lying. By the end of the day, he attacked our boy, but his strikes were easily defended. Even when he tried to pressure him, nothing worked, and he left many openings in his movements. Once again, he was defeated for the 314th time that day. That was the number of times his life could have been ended. Our boy had told him many times that he wouldn't be able to react if he closed his eyes, and the old man replied that he could feel the movement through internal energy that way. Indeed, it was possible, and it was as efficient as sight. That was the basics. The problem was that he still couldn't dodge. The old man said the boy's attacks were too fast. Our protagonist said he made it sound as if he were privileged, but that strike was perfectly defendable if his eyes had been open. Our boy told him not to try blaming it on some unknown factor and to take the training more seriously. Kicking the old man away, he said they'd start again. And this time, Lin Sr. seemed to be angry, charging furiously at our protagonist while Lin Jr. was already lying defeated on the ground. A heavy clash occurred between their blades. At night, that same day, the result was the same. Our boy said they'd start again, and the first victim of his beating was the young master. The boy's father tried to counterattack, but had his sword stopped by our protagonist, who nearly disarmed him in a single strike, taking the opportunity to defeat him. Time and again, they kept trying. Far away in the Great Truth Sect's building, people were drinking tea. Their leader believed everything would go well, since Manhwa had sent a second-generation disciple. He had hired the Miss Tiger Blade to do the job, and even hoped our protagonist would be harshly humiliated. The hired assassin noticed the old man was very malicious, saying it would be a miracle if he didn't leave his opponent crippled. His only question was whether the old man was sure about it, since it could bring negative reputation to his sect, but the old man didn't care. There was another faction in the Jiangyu city stirring hostility. He assured the assassin there was nothing to worry about as he would handle the bureaucratic part of the duel. Hearing this, the mercenary realized he was very arrogant. That old man didn't care if he made enemies of other sects. You shouldn't be so confident. His techniques weren't negligible, but he was definitely a weak person. To act that way, he must at least have either power or political influence. That man was blinded by his own greed, or maybe just dumber than average. Bathed in moonlight, the strongman continued training. Up on the roof, our boy watched the strongman's effort to master that technique, which was already looking quite good. The sword was moving with weight, even though it was a light weapon. Perhaps it would be better to give him a heavy sword. Then our protagonist began reflecting on something. He hadn't imagined they would send an assassin there, which proved they were unscrupulous. It was a sign that the Manhwa sect was being underestimated, and that alone was enough reason to eradicate their enemies. Then our protagonist heard footsteps. It was the sect leader, who had gone outside. He looked carefully at the moon lighting the sky and turned back inside. Our boy observed this closely. He remembered that the man's eldest son had lost his life in a duel against the Great Truth Sect. Perhaps this duel could serve as personal revenge, and he began to envy the man who would finally have his vengeance fulfilled. Finally, the day of the duel arrived. The extras from the other sect were surprised by what they saw, for that boy had changed a lot in the last few days. His body was covered in injuries, and one of his eyes was barely open. The young thug asked Lin Jr. if he was going to fight in such a pathetic state, and the boy admitted to being disappointed that they wouldn't be using real swords. The young thug found that amusing, saying Lin Jr. should be glad they were fake, otherwise he could end up in serious trouble. However, he noticed there was something different about his rival. He was so calm that it made him feel ignored, which only fueled his anger. As they seemed ready, the duel's referee announced that the match would begin shortly. The duel was meant to compare the opponent's skills. It was hard to avoid injuries, and he would intervene if things got too serious. All 3 rounds would be held to determine the winning side. Then our protagonist noticed something. He looked carefully at the other side, identifying the man who would be his opponent. Seeing the man's face made him thoughtful. Our boy wondered what he was doing there. The referee said the first duel would be fought with wooden swords, while the other 2 would be with real weapons. Now that he had talked enough, it was time for violence. With great enthusiasm, he shouted that it was time for the brawl to begin, because the fight was on and anyone slacking would. The boy immediately stepped forward quickly. The young thug believed he would win again. But Lin Jr. saw that movement as ridiculous and full of openings. Definitely, the weak made excessive movements. He began remembering his hard and painful training alongside our protagonist. He said there was a type of person who tried to intimidate their opponent through movement, classic beginner behavior. However, for those versed in combat, intimidation was unnecessary, and Lin Jr. realized the wooden sword would do the job. He drove the blade of the weapon into the young thug's gut, who merely vomited the previous day's dinner on the spot. But his punishment wasn't over yet. Lin Jr. struck the little punk's face violently, making his body bounce across the arena floor like a soccer ball. That started to excite the people from his sect. With great effort, the little thug tried to stand up. He wasn't used to feeling such intense pain. Looking back, he realized that Lin Jr. had changed. He just couldn't say what it was. His appearance was still the same, but it seemed as if he had taken some kind of booster. Meanwhile, Lin Jr. advanced confidently, because his training had been much worse than this fight. Now he could see how weak his opponent truly was. Trying to get up, the little delinquent asked what he had done, since he had improved so much in such a short time. But before finishing the sentence, Lin Jr. tripped him, making the boy fall headfirst to the ground. Lin Jr. said he was slow, sluggish, and talked too much. If this were a real fight, he would leave as fertilizer. At that moment, the little thug remembered that a stick could still be a lethal weapon. Lin Jr. completely ignored his desperation, striking his sword with great violence. Even so, the little offender was still alive, since the sword had been driven into the arena floor beside a completely terrified child. Looking at his defeated enemy, Lin Jr. smiled because he had the nickname Radiant Star, which clearly wasn't true. From now on, he should be called Crybaby, since he had just soaked his diaper. In the face of that marvelous violence between prepubescent youths, the first duel had found its winner. That left the old man quite enraged. He couldn't believe his son had been defeated, even after coming prepared. He had fed the boy elixirs and medicines to boost his internal energy, but that didn't matter. There were still 2 matches left. He decided he would win the next ones, so the referee called the next contenders. Now the leaders of the respective sects would fight. Lin knew that his opponent seemed to have taken a very rare medicine months earlier. Facing him, he realized it wasn't just a rumor. Even so, he was confident in his own preparation. That couldn't be enough to distract him. He would be fighting a real human being. On the other hand, the arrogant old fool thought Lin was too calm, even knowing he was at a disadvantage, and was eager to see how long he could maintain that composure. The referee announced the start of the second duel, and the old fool vanished. Lin looked around attentively, managing to dodge the first strike. Immediately after, he grabbed the fool's hand, preparing to counterattack. The old man managed to dodge, but got a small cut on his cheek. He immediately kicked Lin in the chest, forcing his opponent back and telling him he was holding back. But apparently that might not be necessary, declaring that he would give his all in this fight. He gripped his sword firmly, and the 2 began exchanging equal blows. The battle was fierce, and those watching could see it was evenly matched. In his anger, the old man kept leaving several openings. Lin knew that if he had been sparring with our protagonist, he would already be dead. Doing that was child's play, and he found a huge opening, taking the opportunity because our protagonist had taught him something very valuable. Lin slashed the fool's belly. The old scoundrel's legs wobbled like a hula hoop, and of course, he stepped in his own blood and almost slipped. Luckily, the wound wasn't deep and he was able to retaliate. Old man Lin was very well prepared, resuming the offensive. He was determined to win the duel, forcing the fool to retreat. Trying to escape the blows, the man performed several flips, landing on his feet like a cat. But doing that made the fool furious, as he realized his belly had been pierced. In a person's core lies the internal energy that circulates through the whole body. By refining that energy, it is possible to condense it to make it even stronger. This is one of the basic foundations of martial arts. The problem is that many people confuse internal art with internal strength. And indeed, it's something very complex, and the author is probably making something up here to make sense of it, coming to the brilliant conclusion that internal arts and internal strength might not be different at all. One is the refinement of the other, which can be achieved through mental fortification. In other words, though equally complex, having strong internal strength is not the same as having good internal art. That's why the fool was getting beaten. Lin managed to grab the idiot's hand again, sliding his blade through the man's belly once more. The fool began to feel he was losing too much blood. Lin did not stop his attacks, ready to show him the sword yet again. The problem was that the fool was almost completely defeated. Looking back in desperation, blood splattered across the arena. People on his side watched in shock. Even the hired assassin was a little surprised, and the match referee, who had witnessed everything from up close, was speechless. The sword nearly reached the fool's mech, but that was stopped by our protagonist, who intervened in the fight to preserve the life of that human trash, grabbing the blade of the sword with his bare hands. He made it very clear that this was already enough, because more than anyone, he understood what the leader of the Fresh Flowers was going through. That man had wanted to carry out his revenge, but unfortunately, it didn't happen. Now that the fool had been brutally weakened, the duel was over, and the victory was given to the Fresh Flowers clan. Outside, their disciples began to celebrate. They wouldn't have to abandon that territory. Meanwhile, the fool tried to collect himself after what happened. For him, defeat was an impossible outcome. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. Watching everything, the assassin told himself that the fool should have stayed calm, but went overboard. Now he wondered if it would be necessary to fight that scary kid, thinking he might surrender as soon as the match began. The referee said that the Fresh Flowers sect had won twice, so the final victory was theirs. But even so, they would continue with the rules, and the third match would happen because violence was the question, and the answer would always be yes. As he called for the third participant, Old Man Lin apologized to our protagonist. He had let his emotions get the better of him and had injured our protagonist, who was next to fight. Considering they had already secured victory, he suggested that he surrender. But our protagonist didn't even notice the small wound, making it clear it wasn't his blood. It had already been on Old Man Lin's sword, probably smeared when he grabbed it, and it likely belonged to the old man from the other sect. When he heard this, Old Man Lin was impressed, since our protagonist had grabbed a sword without getting hurt. He knew the boy was very talented. He just hadn't expected him to be so brokenly strong. While they were talking, someone interrupted the moment. It was the old fool who accepted that his sect had lost but had a favor to ask. He wanted Old Man Lin to be a little more understanding. Now that they had lost a duel, he would hand over all rights to him. However, Old Man Lin was very upset because he knew those were his enemies, and now they were putting on a pathetic act. It had to be some kind of trick. Once again, using his sound technique, our protagonist asked to handle the situation. Old Man Lin allowed it. Speaking to the leader of the other sect, he complimented the man's thick, wrinkled skin, saying that otherwise he might already be dead, and added that he had a proposal. If they won the next duel, they would allow them to remain in that region. However, if that didn't happen, they would have to abandon the city and fend for themselves. Now, he wanted to know what the fool thought of that. He only asked that they confirm what would be given up if they truly lost, and the old fool said he would hand over the rights to his sect. So between them, they agreed it would be settled that way, making it clear that something had to be offered that the duels themselves could not achieve. Once again pressured, the fool grew annoyed with our protagonist. He had no other choice now. He promised that he would also hand over 5 great orbs, which were highly valuable items to the people of that world. Pleased with that, our protagonist said he should have suggested it from the start. Old Man Lin accepted the proposal. The final duel would decide everything and more. Standing up, the assassin realized he could not afford to lose this fight. He said he had a few words for our protagonist, that a reckless young man like him could end up ruining himself, and this was his chance to surrender. But that didn't intimidate our boy, who was confident, believing he would emerge victorious from this clash. The Blade of the Mist Tiger, a title given to someone who hunts tigers without using a firearm. In his past life, our protagonist had encountered this man and remembered that he was very skilled. He knew exactly what happened that day. He had been more skilled than expected. If memory served, he had lasted 3 rounds in that battle. He might have survived longer if his sword hadn't broken, so our protagonist was curious to see if this assassin could pose any danger now. The referee saw they were ready. He gave the signal for the match to begin, and the assassin immediately vanished. Old Man Lin was startled. This speed was impressive even for him. He knew the Mist Tiger was strong, but he couldn't follow him with just his eyes, a sign of real danger. The enemy prepared to strike, but our protagonist defended skillfully, making the tiger even more excited. Interrupting his generic speech, our boy landed a palm strike, denting the fool's chest plate and sending the assassin flying back. He recovered quickly, but realized his opponent had disappeared, immediately refocusing on the battle, only to be harshly surprised by our protagonist's attacks. The spectators were amazed. It looked as if beams of light were clashing in combat. Old Man Lin knew it wasn't light at all, but sparks caused by the swords clashing. And as expected, the enemy was a formidable opponent. The pretty girl noticed that our protagonist seemed weaker than usual. She wanted to know why he was holding back against this opponent. The assassin, on the other hand, was starting to feel pressured, receiving a first cut to the leg, followed by a shallow cut on the arm. That was enough for him to realize his opponent was not an ordinary fighter and shouldn't have been underestimated. That he still believed victory was his. Concentrating his power into his sword, he declared he would crush him, unleashing his deadly fangs against our protagonist, sending a powerful blast of internal energy his way. Faced with that, our boy had to gain some distance, like he blocked the energy strike with his sword. He had seen this technique before in his past life and had used the same method to break it, but this time he chose to do it differently. Manipulating the energy in his sword, he made it appear flexible, completely blocking the incoming attacks, creating a great energy shield that resembled the blossoms of a plum tree. His companions were impressed. It was similar to the technique they knew, but far better, for it wasn't just defense, but attack as well. Then our protagonist began striking using the plum blossoms, in true Senbun Sakura Kagyoshi style. It was so beautiful and terrifying that everyone was stunned. Even the assassin never imagined he would have such a beautiful death, as he was now completely engulfed by the petals. His blade wasn't enough to block the sheer volume of the attack, and multiple cuts tore through his body. Given the extent of the wounds, he was completely defeated. Our protagonist informed the referee that the clown lying behind him could no longer fight. The duel needed to be ended, and the winner was finally declared. The fool who witnessed it all had nothing left to say. This was not how he had envisioned his life, and now he didn't know what to do. Unfortunately, he had made a huge promise to the winners. Everyone began to comment that Manhwa had very powerful disciples, and all wanted to know our protagonist's name, since even the blade of the Mist Tiger had been defeated so easily, a sign that this young man was promising. For a moment, our boy basked in the praise. Then, using his sound technique, he spoke to the fool, saying he must regret losing that treasure. He did this because he knew his sect, so small, couldn't possibly possess something so valuable. The people who had given it to the fool must have been very powerful. In any case, our protagonist thanked him for the contribution and wished the worm good luck in his future. While the man was left completely stunned, someone hidden in the forest observed everything, and the result was not satisfactory. That night, everyone gathered and drank heavily. Poor old man Lin challenged his own liver to a personal duel, and apparently he lost. Outside, our boy explained why he had gone easy on his opponent. He wanted to better understand his techniques. Now his companions understood his reasons. Moreover, the technique he had used was different from the one they had learned. The promising student wanted to know if this was the reason they were leaving in the middle of the night, but our protagonist didn't want to interact with people. It had been hard enough to listen to old man Lin pouring his heart out while drunk. Leaving the next day would have been even more troublesome. To the promising student, the explanation made sense, and the pretty girl wanted to know their next destination. The truth was, there was another hidden reason. Our protagonist wanted to find the people working behind this sect of truth, but it seemed they had already left. The problem was that our boy wanted to learn their true objectives, and while someone was being knocked out in the forest, he had a bad feeling about what might happen. From what had just occurred, it seemed the people helping the Great Truth Sect had come to collect that debt. Hey everyone, did you enjoy the story? I really liked it. If you want to follow the next part, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. See you in the next story, guys.